Freeloader, my dad said, laughing loudly in front of the entire restaurant. The next morning, his billionaire boss stood up and addressed me with absolute respect. "Good morning, ma'am." My family's smug smiles vanished instantly. They never saw it coming. "My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and if you have ever been treated like the scapegoat of your own family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe because you will definitely want to hear how I handed them the ultimate bill." The heavy leather checkbook landed directly on my plate, sliding across a smear of sweet potato puree before hitting my water glass with a sharp clink. I looked up. My brother-in-law Trent was leaning back in his velvet booth, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He wore a pastel polo shirt that looked entirely out of place in the dimly lit, ultra-exclusive Atlanta soul food fusion restaurant, but he carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he owned the room. "I think it is time the freeloader paid her fair share," Trent said, a mocking smirk playing on his lips. "You have been unemployed for 6 months, Kendra. Consider this your motivation to get off the couch." Laughter erupted around the table. It was not a gentle teasing laughter. It was the loud, booming, performative laughter of my father, Calvin. He slapped his hand against the mahogany table, looking around to see if anyone in the neighboring VIP booths had noticed his wealthy son-in-law making a joke. "Trent is right," my father chuckled, adjusting the lapels of his suit. "You have been sitting at home doing absolutely nothing since you left your corporate job. It is embarrassing. A 35-year-old woman with no husband, no career, and no ambition. Pay the bill, Kendra. Maybe losing $1,000 will light a fire under you to actually do something with your life." I stared at the checkbook. The total printed at the bottom of the receipt was $1,200. They had ordered truffle macaroni and cheese duck confit collard greens, 2 bottles of imported vintage wine, and tomahawk steaks. I had ordered a simple side salad and a glass of tap water. I shifted my gaze to my mother, Vivian. She was adjusting her diamond necklace, her hair perfectly pressed for Sunday service tomorrow morning. She always cared more about how our family looked to the congregation and her social circle than how we actually treated each other behind closed doors. "Look at you," my mother sighed, her eyes sweeping over my tailored but unbranded charcoal blazer. "You come to a high-end restaurant looking like you shopped at a thrift store. Why can you not be more like your sister Jasmine? Always looks immaculate. And she married a real provider. Trent takes care of her while you are just dragging our family name down." Jasmine. My 32-year-old sister sat beside Trent, flipping her expensive extensions over her shoulder. She was the golden child, the lifestyle influencer, who posted perfectly curated pictures of a life she did not actually pay for. She offered me a pitying look that made my blood boil. "Mom is just looking out for you," Kendra, Jasmine said sweetly. "Trent works so hard managing his real estate investments. He is a natural provider. It is stressful carrying the financial weight of the family. You really should not expect him to pay for your meal when you contribute nothing." The sheer audacity of the conversation hung in the air. For a moment, the bustling sounds of the restaurant faded away, the clinking of silverware and the low hum of jazz music disappearing into the background. I looked at the 4 people sitting across from me. These were the people who were supposed to protect me, yet they took absolute joy in trying to humiliate me. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. My voice was completely calm, devoid of the hysterical reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. "Contribute nothing?" I asked, holding my father's gaze. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Dad, because I seem to remember a very different version of my 20s. I remember being 24 years old, working 80-hour weeks, and writing you a check for $40,000 to save your second mortgage when your bad investments almost lost us our childhood home. I remember missing my own graduation trip because you needed help paying off debts you kept hidden from Mom." My father's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the truth hung between us. "But I guess you conveniently forgot all about that." The moment Trent walked into the picture, I continued, my voice steady and razor sharp. "The moment a white man with a fake Rolex and a whole lot of big talk about real estate showed up, you bent over backward to impress him. You put him on a pedestal and tossed your own daughter to the side because you were so desperate for the kind of status you thought he represented. Do not! You dare raise your voice at your father! My mother hissed, glancing around nervously to see if anyone was listening. God is watching, Kendra. You have no respect. You are just bitter because Trent is a successful man and you are completely alone. I am not bitter. Mom, I replied gently. I am just observant. You worship the illusion of wealth so much that you cannot even see what is right in front of you. Trent laughed loudly, leaning across the table. Are you going to pay the bill, or are you going to keep making up stories to hide the fact that you are broke? If you cannot afford it, just say so. I can cover it. I always do. But you need to stop acting like you are above us when you do not even have a job. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my career choices. They thought I had been unemployed for 6 months. They thought I was sitting in my apartment depressed and failing. What they did not know was that I had spent the last half-decade quietly building a private equity firm from the ground up. I had bypassed the corporate ladder entirely and started buying the ladder itself. I was not unemployed. I was a CEO, and my company had just finalized a massive acquisition that was about to turn their entire world upside down. I reached into my designer handbag. The bag had no loud logos, no flashy monograms, just impeccable craftsmanship that my mother's untrained eye had dismissed as cheap. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a sleek, heavy titanium card. I placed the card directly on top of the leather checkbook. The solid metal hit the glass table with a definitive heavy thud that made the entire table go quiet. It was a black card, an invitation-only tier of wealth that required millions in the bank just to maintain. I slid the checkbook back across the table toward the center. Put the whole table on this, I said smoothly. I would hate for the great provider to stress his finances over some macaroni and cheese. Trent stared at the metal card. The confident smirk melted off his face for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. His eyes narrowed and he let out a loud, mocking scoff, shaking his head as if he had just figured out a magic trick. Wow, Trent said, his voice dripping with condescension. A metal credit card. What is the interest rate on that thing, Kendra? Are you seriously drowning yourself in high-interest debt just to show off for us at dinner? You are going to ruin your credit score trying to pretend you are something you are not. It is actually pathetic. My father pointed his steak knife at me across the restaurant table and called me a freeloader. He laughed, my sister laughed, and my brother-in-law tossed a $1,200 check onto my plate. They thought I was an unemployed college dropout begging for scraps. They did not know I had just spent $80 million buying the very corporation my father worked for. And the next morning, when his billionaire CEO bowed his head and called me ma'am, the look of sheer terror on my family's faces was worth every single penny. Trent leaned back in his velvet booth, crossing his arms over his pastel polo shirt. He looked at me like I was a stain on the restaurant's expensive upholstery. I did not break eye contact. I let his words hang in the air, let the sheer arrogance of his assumptions settle over the table. Jasmine chimed in, swirling the expensive imported wine in her glass. She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, a piece I knew for a fact was cubic zirconia, because I had seen the credit card statement she accidentally left at my apartment 2 years ago. You should really listen to Trent, Kendra, Jasmine said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. He is pitching a massive development deal tomorrow morning. Multi-million dollars. It is to Sterling Holdings. You know Dad's company. Trent is going to completely revitalize their commercial portfolio. You could actually learn a lot from watching a real businessman operate instead of sitting in your apartment applying for entry-level data jobs. Trent puffed out his chest, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the glass table. It is a guaranteed close, he said. Your dad introduced me to the senior acquisition team. I am bringing them a gold mine. We are talking high-yield commercial zoning. It requires a sophisticated understanding of market leverage, something you clearly lack since you think throwing down a fake metal credit card is a substitute for actual wealth. My father, Calvin, wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and pointed his fork at me. Trent is right. In fact, I did you a favor, Kendra. I spoke to the facilities manager at Sterling Holdings on Friday. I pulled some strings. They have an opening in the mailroom. It is basic data entry and package sorting. Minimum wage, but it is honest work. You will report to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. I will personally walk you down to human resources. It is time you learn the value of a hard-earned dollar and stop embarrassing this family with your laziness. I looked at my father, the man who had spent his entire life climbing the middle management ladder, completely obsessed with titles and corner offices. He honestly believed he was offering me salvation by tossing me into a mailroom. He thought he was being a benevolent patriarch rescuing his failed daughter from obscurity. Jasmine let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Please tell me you have something better to wear than that thrift store blazer. Trent has his pitch at 10 a.m., and the last thing he needs is the senior executive seeing his wife's sister pushing a mail cart looking like a homeless person. Do not embarrass him, Kendra. Wear something presentable. I can lend you a dress if you need it. The sheer delusion was almost intoxicating. I looked down at my plate, then back up at the four of them. I reached out, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my wardrobe, which was custom-tailored in Milan. I did not explain that my card was very real. 9 a.m. sharp, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. I will be there, Dad. Send me the exact address of your building. I would hate to be late for such an important day. My father gave a curt, satisfied nod, completely oblivious to the trap he had just walked into. See that you are on time, he said. I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile. I paid the bill, leaving a generous tip for the waiter, and stood up from the table. I wished them a pleasant evening and walked out of the restaurant with my head held high. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally put me in my place. What none of them knew, what they could not possibly comprehend, was that 48 hours ago my private equity firm Apex Acquisitions had finalized a hostile takeover of Sterling Holdings. I was not going to their office tomorrow to sort mail. I was going to inspect my newly acquired property. The humid Atlanta air hit my face as I stepped out of the restaurant. The valet immediately brought my car around a sleek, custom black sedan with tinted windows. The driver opened the door for me, and I slid into the quiet, climate-controlled interior. The noise of the city vanished as the heavy door closed. I pulled my phone from my bag and dialed my assistant, Olivia. She answered on the first ring. Good evening, Kendra, Olivia said, her voice crisp and professional. The restructuring audit documents for tomorrow morning are fully prepped. I have the entire Sterling Holdings executive board scheduled for a briefing at 10:15 a.m. Perfect, I replied, leaning back against the leather seat. Has the financial discovery on the new portfolio been completed? Yes, Olivia said, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing faintly over the line. And you were right. I pulled the personal and business dossiers on Trent. It is a complete house of cards. His real estate investment firm is essentially a shell company. He has no liquid capital. Every single property he claims to own is leveraged to the absolute maximum. He has defaulted on 3 separate commercial loans in the past 18 months. The man is drowning in debt. I watched the city lights blur past my window. My golden child sister and her brilliant provider husband were flat broke, putting on a show of wealth while dodging collection agencies. They were spending money they did not have to project an image of superiority they had not earned. What about the pitch he is making to Sterling Holdings tomorrow? I asked. Olivia paused, and when she spoke again, her voice held a note of genuine concern. This is where it gets complicated, Kendra. I reviewed the funding structure Trent submitted to the Sterling acquisition team. He does not have the capital to back his end of the joint venture. To make his portfolio look solvent, he secured a massive private bridge loan. And who backed the loan? I asked, already dreading the answer. Your father, Olivia said quietly. Calvin co-signed the loan. But it is worse than that. Trent used your parents' home equity and your father's entire corporate pension as collateral. If Trent's pitch tomorrow gets rejected, the bank will immediately call in the debt. Your parents will lose their house and every cent of their retirement. The silence in the car was deafening. My father, the man who had just publicly humiliated me and called me a freeloader, the man who had constantly belittled my ambitions while praising Trent's empty promises, had literally bet his entire life savings on a white man's lies. He had handed over our family's generational wealth to a smooth-talking fraud. He had risked the very roof over my mother's head because he was so blinded by his desperate need for proximity to perceived status. Make sure you print a hard copy of Trent's loan application, I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Bring it to the boardroom tomorrow. I want every single financial record highlighting Calvin's signature. Understood, Olivia replied. Shall I have security on standby? Yes, I said. We are going to need them. I hung up the phone and stared out into the dark. For years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had let them project their insecurities onto me. I had let them cast me as the family failure so Jasmine could shine. But tomorrow, the illusion was going to shatter. I was going to walk into my building, sit at the head of my boardroom table, and systematically dismantle every single lie they had built their lives upon. And I was going to start by pulling the floor right out from under the golden boy. I let his pathetic insult wash right over me. I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply picked up the heavy brass pen the waiter had left behind and signed my name on the merchant copy of the receipt. I added a 50% tip to the bill, placed the pen down, and stood up from the table. Have a wonderful evening, I said, my voice completely smooth. I will see you tomorrow at 9 in the morning, Dad. I would hate to be late for my first day in the mailroom. I turned my back on them and walked away. I could feel their eyes burning into my spine, but I did not rush my pace. I walked out of the bustling dining room, leaving the sounds of clinking crystal and pretentious laughter behind me. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open, and the humid Atlanta night air hit my face. It felt incredibly refreshing. The valet recognized me immediately. He signaled to a driver waiting near the curb. A massive custom black armored SUV pulled up to the entrance. The driver stepped out in a tailored suit, opening the heavy rear door for me with a respectful nod. I slid into the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the back seat. The door shut with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly silencing the city noise outside. I settled into the leather seat and pulled my phone from my bag. I tapped a single contact. My assistant Olivia answered on the very first ring. Good evening, Kendra, Olivia said. Her voice was sharp, professional, and wide awake despite the late hour. The executive boardroom at Sterling Holdings is fully prepped for your arrival tomorrow morning. Security has been briefed on the new ownership structure, and the entire restructuring audit is ready for your review. Excellent, I replied, staring out the tinted window as my driver navigated the busy Atlanta streets. Has the financial discovery on the new portfolio been completed? Yes, Olivia stated. The ink on the Apex Acquisitions takeover dried exactly 48 hours ago. We have full access to every internal file, every pending deal, and every personnel record at Sterling Holdings. I also pulled the personal and business dossiers you requested on Trent. I smiled into the darkness of the car. And what did you find? Olivia paused, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing faintly over the line. It is a complete house of cards, Kendra. He is not a real estate mogul. He is a grifter. His investment firm is essentially a shell company layered over 3 other shell companies. He has absolutely no liquid capital. Every single property he claims to own is leveraged to the absolute maximum. He has defaulted on 3 separate commercial loans in the past 18 months. The man is drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. I let out a slow, deep breath. My golden child sister and her brilliant provider husband were flat broke. They were putting on a spectacular show of wealth while aggressively dodging collection agencies. They drove leased luxury cars, wore fake designer accessories, and spent money they did not actually have just to project an image of superiority they had never earned. And my parents worshipped them for it. My mother and father bowed down to Trent simply because he possessed the right skin color and the right arrogant swagger, completely blind to the fact that he was bleeding them dry. What about the big real estate pitch he is making to Sterling Holdings tomorrow? I asked. This is where it gets incredibly complicated, Olivia said, her tone shifting to something much more serious. I reviewed the funding structure Trent submitted to the Sterling acquisition team. He does not have the capital to back his end of the joint venture. He is completely broke. To make his portfolio look solvent for the pitch tomorrow, He secured a massive private bridge loan from a highly predatory lending group. And who backed that loan? I asked, already feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. Your father, Olivia said quietly. Calvin co-signed the loan. I closed my eyes. My father had co-signed a fraudulent loan for millions of dollars. It gets worse, Olivia continued. Trent did not just use your father's signature. He used your parents' home equity and your father's entire corporate pension as the collateral for the bridge loan. If Trent's pitch tomorrow gets rejected by Sterling Holdings, the lenders will immediately call in the debt. Trent will declare bankruptcy, and your parents will lose their house and every single cent of their retirement savings. The silence in the back of the SUV was deafening. My father, the man who had just publicly humiliated me in a crowded restaurant, the man who had laughed while calling me a freeloader, had literally bet his entire life savings on a white man's lies. He had handed over our family's generational wealth to a smooth-talking con artist. He had risked the very roof over my mother's head because he was so desperately blinded by his need for proximity to perceived status. He thought Trent was a genius. He thought Trent was the son he always wanted. He looked at me, a black woman who had built an $80 million private equity firm from a laptop in a studio apartment, and saw nothing but failure. He looked at Trent, a fraud drowning in debt, and saw a king. Print a hard copy of Trent's entire loan application, I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I want every single financial record highlighting Calvin's signature printed and bound. Bring it to the boardroom tomorrow morning. Understood, Olivia replied. Shall I have corporate security on standby? Yes, I said, my gaze hardening as the city lights blurred past the window. We are going to need them. I hung up the phone and set it down on the leather seat beside me. For years I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had let them project their deep insecurities onto me. I had let them cast me as the family failure just so Jasmine could shine in the spotlight. I had absorbed their passive-aggressive insults, their cruel jokes, and their blatant disrespect. I leaned my head back against the headrest, letting the reality of Olivia's words sink into my bones. My parents were completely destitute, and they did not even know it yet. My mother, Vivian, spent her entire life weaponizing church-going respectability. She paraded Jasmine around every Sunday, bragging about her daughter's perfect marriage to a wealthy investor. She used Trent's fake success as a bludgeon to beat me down, constantly reminding me that my relentless focus on building my business had left me old, single, and undesirable. And all the while, the golden couple was secretly siphoning away the very foundation of my parents' lives. Trent was a parasite, and Calvin had willingly handed him the keys to the host. My father had spent 30 years at Sterling Holdings, obsessing over middle management titles, bowing down to his superiors, and demanding absolute obedience from his own family. He demanded I respect his authority, yet he lacked the basic business acumen to see a bad deal when it was sitting right across from him at the dinner table. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, my father expected to watch me suffer. He expected to march me down to a windowless basement room and hand me a stack of envelopes. He wanted to break my spirit to make himself feel powerful. He wanted to parade me past Trent as a cautionary tale of what happens when you do not follow the rules. Instead, he was going to walk into an execution. Olivia, I typed quickly into a secure message on my phone. Make sure Mr. Elias Sterling is present in the lobby at exactly 9 in the morning. I want the transition of power to be perfectly clear the moment I walk through those glass doors. Consider it done, Olivia replied instantly. I locked my phone screen. The drive back to my penthouse felt shorter than usual. The anger that had simmered in my chest for 35 years had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. I did not feel sorrow for my parents. I did not feel pity for my sister. They had made their choices. They had valued a fraudulent aesthetic over their own flesh and blood. They had looked at my relentless work ethic and called it a failure simply because it did not look like the traditional submission they required. Tomorrow they would learn the truth about Apex acquisitions. They would learn exactly who bought out Sterling Holdings. They would learn who held the debt to their precious son-in-law's fake empire. And most importantly, they would finally learn the true cost of underestimating a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. The morning sun reflected off the towering glass facade of Sterling Holdings as my driver pulled up to the front entrance. I stepped out of the vehicle and took a deep breath of the crisp Atlanta air. For years, I had walked past buildings exactly like this one, carrying the weight of my family's relentless disappointment on my shoulders. I used to shrink myself in these corporate spaces, hoping to fly under the radar, hoping that if I worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, I would eventually earn the respect my father so freely handed out to everyone else. But today was entirely different. I was not walking into this building as Calvin's disgraced daughter. I was walking in as the apex predator of the food chain. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit. It was a bespoke deep plum wool ensemble that I had commissioned in London a few months prior. The cut was immaculate, wrapping around my frame with absolute precision, exuding a quiet, lethal authority. It cost $5,000, and it looked worth every single penny. It was a stark contrast to the lazy, broken image my family insisted on projecting onto me. I walked through the revolving glass doors, and the bustling noise of a corporate Monday morning instantly surrounded me. The lobby was a vast expanse of imported white marble and brushed steel. Executives rushed past with briefcases clutching their coffees, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had legally shifted owners just 48 hours ago. I spotted my assistant Olivia standing discreetly near the security turnstiles. She gave me a single confirming nod. The board members were upstairs. The trap was set. Before I could walk over to her, a loud, shrill voice cut through the ambient hum of the lobby. "What on earth are you wearing, Kendra?" I turned to see my sister Jasmine marching across the marble floor toward me. She was flanked by Trent, who trailed slightly behind her, gripping a leather portfolio so tightly his knuckles were turning white. They had stationed themselves near the VIP reception desk, buzzing with a frantic, desperate energy. Jasmine was wearing a bright pink designer dress with a massive, gaudy logo splashed across the chest. It was the uniform of someone desperately trying to signal wealth to people who already possessed it. She stopped 2 feet away from me, her eyes sweeping up and down my tailored suit, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a sneer of pure condescension. "I told you not to embarrass Trent today," Jasmine hissed, dropping her voice so the nearby receptionists would not hear. "What is this outfit? Did you max out another credit card buying a cheap knockoff just to try and impress the mailroom supervisor? You look like you are trying way too hard, Kendra." It is actually sad. Real executives can spot fake tailoring a mile away. Do not walk around here pretending you belong on the upper floors. You are here to sort envelopes. I looked at my sister. The irony was so rich it was practically suffocating. She was standing in my lobby wearing a dress she had likely purchased on a credit card, funded by our father's stolen retirement pension, lecturing me about projecting fake wealth. Her entire existence was a carefully constructed facade, a delicate glass house built on a foundation of fraudulent loans and staggering debt. Yet she still possessed the sheer audacity to look me in the eye and try to make me feel small. "I think the suit looks perfectly fine for the basement," Trent chimed in, stepping up beside his wife. He did not bother looking me in the eye. His gaze was fixed on the bank of executive elevators, his foot tapping nervously against the floor. He was sweating. I could see a faint sheen of moisture collecting along his hairline. He was a man walking to the gallows, hoping his silver tongue could save him from the financial ruin waiting upstairs. "Listen," Kendra Trent continued, speaking to me with the casual, dismissive tone one might use on a disobedient servant. "Jasmine and I have a massive pitch with the senior acquisition team in about 20 minutes. I am talking career-making numbers here. We need to be razor sharp, and frankly, my caffeine levels are running dangerously low." Trent reached into the pocket of his trousers, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and held it out toward my chest. He actually snapped his fingers at me. A sharp, loud, incredibly disrespectful sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Run across the street to that coffee shop and get us 2 large oat milk lattes," Trent ordered. "Keep the change. Consider it an advance on your first mailroom paycheck. Just be quick about it." The adults have real business to conduct today, and I do not want to be waiting around when the board members call us up. I stared at the crumpled bill in his extended hand. I did not move. I did not flinch. The sheer racial and class entitlement radiating from this man, a grifter who had contributed absolutely nothing to society besides empty promises and defaulted loans, was almost mesmerizing to witness. He truly believed that his proximity to my father and his inherent privilege granted him the authority to treat a black woman like his personal errand runner. I looked up from the money and met his gaze. My expression was perfectly neutral, but the temperature in the space between us seemed to drop significantly. "I am not fetching your coffee, Trent," I said smoothly, my voice carrying clearly over the lobby noise. "In fact, fetching anything for you is nowhere on my itinerary today, but you should probably hold on to that $20 bill. Given the absolute state of your financial leverage, you are going to need every spare dollar you can find for your upcoming legal defense." Jasmine gasped dramatically, her hand flying to her chest. "Excuse me. How dare you speak to my husband that way? You are so bitterly jealous of him, it is making you delusional. You are just a broke failure trying to drag down a successful man because you cannot stand to see me happy." I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "Successful men do not sweat through their shirts in the lobby, Jasmine. And happy women do not wear cubic zirconia and pretend it is a Cartier diamond." Jasmine went completely pale. Her hand instantly dropped from her chest to cover her wrist, shielding the bracelet I had just correctly identified as a cheap imitation. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The absolute shock of being perceived so accurately, of having her carefully maintained illusion punctured with a single calm sentence, left her entirely speechless. Trent turned red, his anger finally overriding his nervous anxiety. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, pointing a finger directly at my face. "Listen to me, you ungrateful failure," he started, his voice rising in volume. Before he could finish his threat, a loud melodic chime echoed through the lobby. The polished chrome doors of the private executive elevator slid smoothly open. My father Calvin stepped out onto the marble floor. He was wearing his best power suit, clearly trying to project the image of a seasoned corporate heavyweight. He expected to step into the lobby and see me cowering in a corner, clutching a resume and waiting for my pathetic mailroom orientation. He expected me to be looking completely defeated and entirely subservient. Instead, he saw me standing tall in a $5,000 suit, staring down his golden son-in-law with absolute unshakable authority. Calvin's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He marched across the lobby floor, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly as he closed the distance between us. His eyes were wide with furious indignation. He could not fathom that I would dare to stand my ground against the man he had chosen as the family savior. He was preparing to destroy me right there in front of the reception desk, preparing to scream at me for my insubordination, entirely unaware that the man who truly ran his life was about to step off that exact same elevator. My father stormed across the polished white marble of the Sterling Holdings lobby, his face a mottled mask of crimson rage. His heavy wingtip shoes slapped against the immaculate floor in a staccato rhythm of misplaced authority. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my chest before he had even come to a full stop. He did not care who was watching. He did not care about creating a scene in the very building where he had spent 30 years bowing to his superiors. He only cared that his authority was being challenged by the one person he had designated as his permanent subordinate. "What do you think you are doing, Kendra?" Calvin hissed, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper designed to humiliate me without echoing too loudly toward the security turnstiles. "I give you the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to actually make something of your pathetic life, and you stand here harassing your brother-in-law in the middle of my corporate lobby." I did not step back. I held my ground, my hands resting lightly at my sides, feeling the impeccable drape of my $5,000 bespoke suit. I let him look at me, really look at me, but his eyes were so clouded with pre-existing bias that he could not even process the quality of the fabric or the precision of the cut. He just saw the failure he desperately needed me to be. Trent immediately puffed out his chest, stepping safely behind my father's broad shoulders like a cowardly child seeking a shield. She is entirely out of control, Calvin, Trent said, his voice dripping with fabricated victimhood and exaggerated exhaustion. Jasmine and I were just standing here quietly trying to mentally prepare for the biggest pitch of our lives, and she starts spewing delusional nonsense about my finances. It is pathetic. She is actively trying to sabotage me right before my meeting because she is so intensely jealous of our success. Jasmine nodded vigorously, clutching Trent's arm and stepping into my father's line of sight. She insulted my jewelry. Dad, Jasmine whined, her voice pitching into a nasal complaint. She is standing here wearing some cheap knockoff suit she probably bought on a clearance rack, and she is acting like she owns the building. Trent asked her to grab us a coffee, a simple favor since he is under so much pressure to provide for this family, and she flat out refused. You need to send her home before she ruins Trent's meeting and embarrasses you in front of the senior acquisition team. My father's eyes narrowed into dark, furious slits. He looked at me with a level of pure, unfiltered disgust that used to break my heart when I was a teenager. Now it just fueled my absolute unshakable resolve. You are an absolute disgrace, Kendra. Calvin spat, leaning in close so I could smell the stale coffee and aggressive cologne radiating off his skin. You have always been a bitter, ungrateful burden to this family. You cannot stand to see your sister happy. You cannot stand to see a real man like Trent succeeding where you have so miserably failed. Well, you have finally crossed the line. There are consequences for this level of disrespect. He slashed his hand through the air in a sharp, dismissive gesture, slicing through the space between us. The mailroom job is gone, Calvin declared, his voice rising in volume, drawing the curious eyes of a few passing junior executives. I am calling Human Resources right now and officially pulling the offer. You are not working in my building. You are not fit to scrub the floors in a place like this. Your building, I repeated softly, testing the absolute staggering delusion of his words. Yes, my building. Calvin snarled, his face inching closer to mine. I have given 3 decades of my life to Sterling Holdings. I command respect in these halls. I have built a legacy here, and I will not allow my deadbeat daughter to jeopardize my standing or my son-in-law's multi-million-dollar pitch. You are done, Kendra. Do not bother coming to Thanksgiving. Do not bother calling your mother. I am officially washing my hands of you. Until you can learn to respect your superiors, admit your failures, and formally apologize to Trent, you are completely cut out of this family. Now turn around, walk out those revolving doors, and get out of my sight. The ultimatum hung heavily in the air. Disownment, the ultimate weapon in the narcissistic parent's arsenal. He expected me to crumble right there on the marble floor. He expected tears, frantic apologies, and desperate pleading to be allowed back into the fold. Jasmine was practically vibrating with joy, a triumphant, vicious smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. Trent crossed his arms over his pastel polo shirt, looking down his nose at me, entirely secure in the false protection of my father's middle management shadow. They were all waiting for my collapse. I simply looked past my father's shoulder at the large digital clock mounted on the wall above the main reception desk. 8:59, perfect timing. Before I could even open my mouth to respond to my father's pathetic, empty threat, a distinct, deep chime echoed through the cavernous lobby. It was not the standard high-pitched ping of the employee elevators. It was the heavy, resonant, commanding tone of the private VIP lift, a dedicated biometric access car reserved exclusively for C-suite executives and top-tier board members. The thick frosted glass doors slid open with a quiet, expensive whisper. Elias Sterling stepped out. He was a man who needed absolutely no introduction in the corporate world. At 68 years old, he carried himself with the effortless, terrifying power of a man who controlled billions of dollars in global assets. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that made my father's off-the-rack department store blazer look like cheap synthetic paper. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the bustling lobby with the predatory calculation of a seasoned apex shark. For decades, Elias had been the undisputed king of Sterling Holdings. Today, he was simply the man handing over the crown. The physical transformation of my father was instantaneous, dramatic, and entirely revolting to witness. The red-hot fury completely melted off his face, replaced immediately by a pale, sweating mask of absolute desperate subservience. His broad shoulders slumped forward, his chest caved inward, and he practically shrank in on himself, shedding his aggressive patriarch persona in a fraction of a second. He was no longer the roaring tyrant throwing his daughter out on the street. He was a terrified, groveling middle manager desperate for a single scrap of validation from his ultimate superior. "Mr. Sterling." Calvin gasped, his voice pitching up a full octave as he scrambled forward, physically pushing past me to get closer to the CEO. He practically bowed as he moved his hands fluttering nervously at his sides. "Good morning, sir. What an unexpected, tremendous honor to see you down in the main lobby today. I hope your morning is going exceptionally well." Elias did not stop walking. He moved with a measured, deliberate, unstoppable stride, his gaze fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring the sea of employees parting for him like the Red Sea. Calvin, utterly desperate to capitalize on this rare momentary proximity to absolute power, frantically gestured toward Trent. Trent immediately straightened his posture, frantically wiping his sweaty palms on the sides of his trousers. He tried to summon the arrogant, untouchable swagger he had displayed just moments ago when he was demanding I fetch his coffee. "Sir, if I may take just a brief moment of your time," Calvin stammered, walking awkwardly alongside Elias, practically jogging to keep pace without blocking the billionaire's path. "I would love to introduce you to my son-in-law, Trent Blackwood. He is the principal investor I was telling the senior acquisition team about. He is the future of real estate in this city, sir. He is bringing a massive, highly lucrative commercial development portfolio to the board today. It is going to completely revolutionize our holdings and bring unprecedented value to the firm." Trent stepped forward, pasting on a blinding artificial smile that looked more like a grimace of panic. He thrust his right hand out toward the billionaire CEO, ready to deliver his practiced, slick elevator pitch to save his fraudulent empire. "An absolute honor, Mr. Sterling," Trent said, his voice straining for confidence. "Trent Blackwood, I am very much looking forward to revolutionizing your commercial division today and showing you what real aggressive leverage looks like." Elias Sterling did not break his stride. He did not slow his pace. He did not look at Trent's desperate, sweating face. He did not look at my father's pleading eyes. He treated their outstretched hands, their groveling introductions, and their very existence as if they were nothing more than an irritating, invisible draft of wind. The absolute freezing dismissal was breathtaking. Elias simply walked right past them, leaving Trent standing in the middle of the lobby, with his hands suspended awkwardly in midair, his fake smile freezing into a permanent mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Calvin stumbled to a clumsy halt, his mouth hanging open in complete shock, his brain completely unable to process why the legendary CEO had just entirely ignored the man he had promised was the brilliant future of the company. Jasmine let out a small, high-pitched gasp of confusion, her hand dropping limply from Trent's rigid arm. Elias stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The bustling corporate lobby seemed to fall completely silent. The receptionists stopped typing on their keyboards. The passing executives froze in their tracks. Everyone in the immediate vicinity could feel the sudden, massive, undeniable shift in gravity. My father, standing a few yards away, turned around slowly, his eyes darting frantically between me and his boss, a look of rising horror dawning on his face. Elias Sterling stood squarely before me. He reached up with absolute precision and buttoned the center button of his suit jacket, a universal corporate gesture of deep, formal respect. He then extended his right hand toward me, not with the casual dismissal of a superior, but with the firm, deliberate intention of an equal addressing his conqueror. "Good morning, ma'am. The boardroom is prepped for your restructuring audit." The silence that fell over the sweeping marble lobby was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that occurs right before a massive structural collapse. The bustling noise of the corporate morning, the clicking heels, the ringing phones, the low hum of ambitious conversations seemed to vanish, entirely sucked into the vacuum of my father's paralyzing shock. Calvin simply stood there, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting frantically between my extended hand and the firm, respectful grip of his billionaire CEO. His brain was visibly short-circuiting. He had spent 30 years bowing to Elias Sterling, treating the man as a deity who walked the earth. And now that deity was addressing his scapegoat daughter with a title reserved for the highest echelons of power. "Sir," my father finally stammered, a high, nervous laugh bubbling up from his throat. His voice sounded thin and reedy, completely devoid of the booming arrogance he had weaponized against me at dinner the night before. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize. There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding here. This is Kendra. She is my daughter. She is completely unemployed." Elias did not release my hand. He simply turned his head, his icy blue eyes locking onto my father. The look of pure, unadulterated disdain on the older man's face was a masterclass in corporate superiority. Elias looked at Calvin the way one might look at a confused, poorly trained dog that had just wandered into a boardroom. Calvin desperately tried to laugh again, stepping forward and waving his hands in a frantic erasing motion. "I spoke to the facilities manager on Friday, sir. I pulled a few strings to get her a shift down in the mailroom. Basic package sorting. She is confused about where she is supposed to be. I am so terribly sorry she bothered you. Kendra, step away from Mr. Sterling immediately and go to the freight elevator." I did not move an inch. I slowly withdrew my hand from Elias's grip, adjusting the cuff of my $5,000 jacket with perfectly deliberate ease. Elias turned fully toward my father, buttoning his suit jacket and standing to his full height. "Calvin Elias," said his voice, dropping into a register so cold it practically frosted the air between them. "The only person standing in this lobby, suffering from profound, embarrassing confusion, is you. I strongly suggest you lower your voice and show some respect before you talk yourself out of a pension." My father physically recoiled, his face draining of all color. His jaw worked up and down, but he could not form a single syllable. He glanced helplessly back at Trent, seeking support from his golden boy, but Trent was completely paralyzed. Elias swept his hand toward me, gesturing with open deference. "It appears you have been deliberately kept in the dark regarding the financial realities of your own industry, Calvin. At exactly 4 p.m. on Friday, the board of Sterling Holdings signed an $80 million cash acquisition agreement. We sold a controlling 68% stake in this corporation." My father's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the brass security turnstile to keep himself upright. "We sold to a private equity firm called Apex Acquisitions." Elias continued, delivering each word with lethal precision. "And this woman, your daughter, is the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Apex. She is the new majority shareholder of this entire corporation. She is my boss. She is your boss. She owns this building, Calvin." The heavy leather portfolio slipped from Trent's sweaty fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a loud, resounding smack, the sound echoing sharply through the quiet lobby. Stacks of glossy, fraudulently manipulated financial documents spilled across the white stone landing directly at my feet. Trent stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful to witness. As a real estate grifter, he spent his days pretending to be a major player, but playing the game meant he knew the names of the real titans. He knew exactly what Apex Acquisitions was. He knew they were a ruthless, devastatingly efficient private equity firm, known for dismantling bad debt and liquidating fraudulent portfolios. He realized in that exact terrifying second that he had just handed a $20 bill to the apex predator, who now held the absolute power to ruin his entire life. "No," Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling. She shook her head violently, her cheap hair extensions flying over her shoulders. "No, that is a lie. That is completely impossible. She is broke. She lives in a tiny apartment. She does not even have a husband. She cannot afford to buy a company." Jasmine took a frantic step forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You are lying!" she shrieked, her carefully maintained influencer persona completely shattering. "You are playing some kind of sick joke. Dad, tell them she is lying." "Silence, Jasmine," I said. My voice did not echo. I did not yell. I simply spoke with the quiet, crushing authority of a woman who owned the ground she was standing on. Jasmine snapped her mouth shut, her eyes filling with panicking tears. She looked down at the fake diamond bracelet on her wrist, then looked at the impeccable tailoring of my suit. The reality of her own poverty in the face of my actual wealth was finally breaking her fragile, delusional mind. Trent swallowed hard. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone. He bent down, frantically scrambling to gather his scattered pitch documents, his hands visibly shaking. He stood up, clutching the messy stack of papers to his chest, and forced a pathetic, trembling smile. Kendra Trent croaked, trying to sound chummy, trying to deploy the smooth-talking charm that usually saved him. Wow. I had absolutely no idea you were swimming in these kinds of waters. This is incredible. This is actually perfect. We can keep this massive development deal in the family. You and we can build an empire together. I can walk you through the zoning metrics right now. I looked at the sweat dripping down the side of Trent's face. I looked at the desperate, pleading terror in his eyes. He actually thought he could pivot. He actually thought he could pitch his fraudulent, over-leveraged house of cards to the very woman who was holding the match. Keep it in the family, Trent, I asked smoothly, stepping closer to him so he could fully feel the intimidation. You mean exactly the way you kept your bridge loan in the family. By using my father's corporate pension and my mother's home equity as collateral for a deal you knew you could not afford. My father let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He whipped his head around to stare at Trent, his eyes practically bulging out of his skull. The realization of what I had just revealed hit him like a physical blow. The secure, untouchable status he had worshipped his entire life was already gone, signed away by the son-in-law he had chosen over me. We will discuss your tragic financials upstairs, Trent, I said, turning away from his horrified expression. I looked at my father one last time. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his cheap suit. He had spent his entire life telling me I was a failure because I refused to follow his path. He had demanded my obedience while possessing zero vision of his own. Now his legacy, his retirement, and his very survival rested entirely in the palm of my hand. Elias stepped aside, gesturing respectfully toward the open doors of the VIP elevator. The interior gleamed with polished mahogany and brushed brass. After you, ma'am, Elias said. I stepped into the elevator, turning around to face the lobby as the heavy doors prepared to slide shut. I looked at my father, pale and broken, leaning heavily against the turnstile. I looked at Jasmine, crying silently over her shattered illusions. I looked at Trent, clutching his fake documents like a shield that could no longer protect him. I will see you in my boardroom in exactly 5 minutes, I said. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom closed behind me with a solid, airtight seal, instantly shutting out the chaotic murmur of the corporate floor. The space was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, while the center of the room was dominated by a massive polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch on forever. The scent of lemon polish and expensive leather hung in the air. I did not take a seat along the sides. I walked directly to the head of the table, the chair traditionally reserved for Elias Sterling. I pulled it out, sat down, and rested my hands on the cool wood. Olivia took her position, standing just behind my right shoulder. She placed a sleek titanium tablet directly in front of me, tapping the screen once to bring the room's integrated projection system online. A massive high-definition screen silently lowered from a recess in the ceiling at the far end of the boardroom. Let him through, I said quietly, glancing at the security feed on my tablet. I watched the live camera feed as Calvin marched down the corridor. 2 of my corporate security guards stepped into his path, their hands raised in a firm, non-negotiable gesture. Calvin puffed out his chest, his face contorted in an ugly mask of misplaced authority, ready to shout them down. Before he could make a fool of himself, Olivia tapped her earpiece and gave the guards the clearance order. They smoothly stepped aside. Less than 30 seconds later, the boardroom doors flew open. They hit the magnetic stoppers with a loud, aggressive crack that reverberated off the glass walls. Calvin stormed into the room, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying shade of purple. He was holding his cell phone out in front of him like a weapon, the speakerphone icon glowing bright green. "I do not care what kind of trick you think you are playing, Kendra." The tinny, hysterical voice of my mother, Vivian, pierced the quiet elegance of the boardroom. She was practically shrieking through the phone's small speaker. "You are a fraud. You have always been a deceitful, jealous girl. Who did you manipulate to get into that building? Did you forge those documents? Did you find some senile old investor and lie your way into his bank accounts? You are going to prison for this. You are going to destroy your father's career with these illegal games." Calvin slammed the phone down onto the mahogany table. He planted both of his hands on the polished wood and leaned aggressively toward me. The veins in his neck were bulging. He was breathing so heavily I could hear the slight wheeze in his chest. "Turn off this ridiculous charade right now," Calvin demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of absolute rage and underlying panic. "You do not own Sterling Holdings. You do not own anything. You are an unemployed, bitter spinster who sits at home while your sister builds a real life. Elias Sterling is a senile old fool if he thinks letting you play pretend in his boardroom is acceptable. I have given 20 years of my blood, sweat, and tears to this company. I am a senior director. I built the foundation of this regional office. I command respect." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to match his hysterical pitch. I simply reached out and pressed a single button on my tablet. The massive screen at the far end of the room illuminated the dim space with a stark, bright white light. Calvin flinched, his eyes darting away from me to look at the projection. Vivian was still screaming through the phone. "Tell her to get out, Calvin. Call the police. Have her arrested for trespassing. She is trying to ruin Jasmine's big day because she has absolutely nothing going for her." "Mute the line, Olivia," I commanded softly. Olivia pressed a button on her control pad. Vivian's frantic, toxic shrieking was instantly silenced, leaving only the heavy, ragged sound of my father's breathing echoing in the large room. "You built absolutely nothing, Calvin," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any daughterly affection or familial warmth. I was speaking to him not as his child, but as the apex predator of his corporate ecosystem. I tapped the screen of my tablet again. A highly detailed, brutally transparent spreadsheet appeared on the projector. It was a comprehensive performance audit covering the last 2 decades of Calvin's employment at Sterling Holdings. "You claim you gave 20 years of blood and sweat to this company?" I continued, standing up slowly from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. "Let us look at the actual return on that investment. You were promoted to Senior Director of Regional Logistics 12 years ago. Since that specific quarter, your department has consistently underperformed every single other branch in the southeastern sector. Your quarterly growth metrics have been stagnant for exactly 8 years." Calvin stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing silently. The numbers were massive, color-coded in stark red to indicate severe operational losses. "You have coasted by on the coattails of your junior associates," I stated, walking slowly down the length of the mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You take credit for their innovative proposals while maintaining a bloated, entirely unnecessary expense account. You spent $40,000 last year alone on client dinners that yielded a net return of 0 new contracts. Your staff turnover rate is the highest in the entire building because you are a toxic, micromanaging tyrant who leads through intimidation rather than actual competence." "That is proprietary information," Calvin gasped, taking a stumbling step back. "You cannot access those files. You are breaching corporate confidentiality." "I own the files, Calvin," I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I own the servers they are stored on. I own the chair you are gripping, the desk you are leaning against, and the very employment contract that keeps you out of the unemployment line. You are not a corporate titan. You are a mediocre, underperforming middle manager who has cost my newly acquired company hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue due to your sheer, unadulterated incompetence. I dismantled your entire 20-year facade in 60 seconds. You are a liability." Calvin looked like he had been physically struck. The arrogant patriarch who had humiliated me in the restaurant just 12 hours ago was completely gone. He was reduced to a pale, trembling shadow, his eyes darting frantically across the red numbers on the screen that proved his entire life was a lie. He had demanded my respect for decades, but the math proved he had never earned it. Before the crushing reality of his professional worthlessness could fully settle in the room, the boardroom door swung open again. Trent strolled in, carrying his leather portfolio and wearing a blinding, artificially confident smile. He completely misread the temperature of the room. He saw Calvin looking pale and sweating, and he saw me standing near the projector screen. In his deeply ingrained arrogance, Trent assumed Calvin had just finished scolding me. He assumed his whiteness, and his fabricated charm gave him absolute immunity to the power dynamic shifting around him. He walked right past Calvin and marched directly up to the mahogany table, tossing his leather binder down with a loud, dismissive thud. He adjusted his pastel polo shirt and leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table. "All right," Kendra Trent said, letting out a loud, patronizing sigh. "I do not know what kind of stunt you are pulling with the old man, or how you managed to sneak up here to play executive, but the joke is over. We have actual multi-million-dollar business to conduct. I am bringing a high-yield commercial zoning portfolio to this firm that is going to make everyone in this room very rich." He reached into his portfolio, pulled out a thick stack of contract papers, and slid them across the polished wood toward me. He tapped his index finger aggressively against the signature line at the bottom of the page. "I do not have time for your family drama today," Trent said, his voice dripping with unearned entitlement. "My investors are waiting. Just sign the joint venture paperwork so the adults can finally talk." I looked down at the thick stack of premium watermarked paper Trent had just slid across my mahogany table. The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the quiet air of the boardroom. He actually believed he was in absolute control. He thought he could snap his fingers, throw a few empty corporate buzzwords around, and walk out of this room with millions of dollars. I did not touch the paperwork. I simply leaned back in the high leather executive chair, folded my hands in my lap, and studied him the way a scientist might observe a particularly repulsive insect trapped under a microscope. "Olivia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying clearly across the vast room. "Please illuminate Mr. Blackwood on who exactly the adults in this room are." Olivia stepped forward with lethal efficiency. She did not bother picking up Trent's carefully bound portfolio. Instead, she tapped her titanium tablet. The massive digital projector above us shifted instantly. Calvin's miserable performance metrics vanished, replaced immediately by a complex, brutally detailed flowchart mapping out Trent's entire financial existence in stark, unforgiving high definition. Trent frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he turned to look at the screen. "What is this?" Trent demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its country club bravado. "That is not the prospectus I submitted to the acquisition team. Where are my projected yield graphs? Where are my market analysis slides?" "We do not rely on fabricated projections at Apex Acquisitions," I replied smoothly. "We rely on forensic accounting, and your accounting, Trent, is a spectacular tragedy." I stood up from my chair and walked slowly down the length of the table, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. I pointed directly at the center of the illuminated flowchart. "You presented yourself to Sterling Holdings as the principal investor of Blackwood Capital," I said, making sure every word landed with maximum impact. "You promised a joint venture backed by $10 million in liquid assets. You submitted a portfolio claiming ownership of 3 high-yield commercial retail spaces. Except Blackwood Capital does not actually possess $10 million. In fact, Blackwood Capital does not produce any revenue at all." Trent shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward Calvin, who was pressed flat against the glass wall of the boardroom, looking physically ill. "It is a shell company," I continued, my voice cold and surgical. "It is registered in Delaware and layered aggressively over 3 other shell companies to deliberately obscure your total lack of solvency. You do not own a commercial real estate empire, Trent. You own a collection of post office boxes and a severely overdrawn corporate checking account." Trent's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He slammed his hand onto the table, leaning forward aggressively. That is standard corporate structuring, he barked, a visible bead of sweat forming on his forehead. It is strategic tax leveraging. You clearly do not understand how high-level commercial real estate operates. You are completely out of your depth here, Kendra. I understand exactly how fraud operates. I shot back, my voice cracking like a whip through the room. I tapped the table, signaling Olivia. The screen shifted again, displaying 3 glaring red financial notices side by side. Let us talk about your brilliant strategic leveraging. 18 months ago, you defaulted on a $2 million commercial loan for a strip mall project in Midtown. 6 months later, you defaulted on a luxury condominium development. 2 months ago, you missed your 3rd consecutive payment on your own leased office space. Trent opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off instantly. You listed a massive retail revitalization project in the warehouse district as your primary asset for this pitch, I said, walking closer to him. You claimed a 90% occupancy rate. My acquisition team pulled the actual property records this morning. It is an empty dirt lot with a chain-link fence around it. You have virtually zero liquid capital. You are bleeding money, dodging creditors, and keeping your pathetic firm afloat entirely by securing predatory bridge loans to pay off previous predatory bridge loans. You are not a mogul. You are a financial parasite. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. Calvin stared at the screen in pure, unadulterated horror as the myth of his perfect son-in-law completely evaporated before his eyes. Trent was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his pastel shirt. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. So to answer your arrogant demand, I continued walking calmly back to the head of the table and sitting down. I will not be signing your joint venture paperwork. Apex Acquisitions does not partner with incompetent grifters. Your funding request is formally and permanently denied. Your pitch is over. You are dismissed. The polished country club facade Trent had worn for years finally shattered into a million jagged pieces. The charming wealthy provider act vanished, revealing the desperate cornered fraud underneath. His face contorted into a mask of pure vicious rage. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the heavy mahogany table and shaking it violently. "You cannot do this to me!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "You owe me this deal. Your father practically guaranteed this funding. I put months of work into this portfolio. You are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin my life because you are completely alone and nobody wants you." I did not flinch. I just looked at him with absolute pity. "I am ruining your life by reading your actual bank statements out loud." "That is not sabotage, Trent. That is an audit. And you failed." Trent spun around desperately, searching for Calvin. "Calvin, do something!" Trent roared, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "Tell her to sign the paperwork. Order her to approve the funding." "You told me this was a done deal. You promised me Sterling Holdings would back my venture today." Calvin just shook his head slowly, his face drained of all color. He looked entirely paralyzed by the crushing realization that he had absolutely no power, no legacy, and no authority left to exercise. He was a ghost in his own building. Trent looked back at me, his chest heaving. A dark, ugly sneer twisted his lips as he realized playing the victim would not work, and relying on Calvin's authority was completely useless. He decided to play his only remaining card. He decided to pull the pin on the grenade and take everyone down with him. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Trent hissed, leaning entirely across the table. His eyes locked onto mine with manic desperation. "You think you can just deny my funding, play the almighty CEO, and walk away clean? If you tank this deal today, Kendra, my bridge loan collapses by noon. And do you want to know exactly how I secured that loan? Do you want to know what collateral is keeping the bank from destroying me right this second?" Trent let out a breathless, cruel laugh, gesturing wildly toward Calvin's trembling figure. "Your father did not just co-sign my loan," Trent announced, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "He illegally forged documents to pledge his entire Sterling Holdings corporate pension as a guarantee. He committed federal wire fraud to bypass company regulations. And when that was not enough, he secretly pledged your parents' fully paid-off house as the final collateral without telling your mother. If you do not sign this joint venture paperwork right now and fund my company, I declare bankruptcy today. The bank seizes your family's estate, and your father goes to federal prison for corporate fraud." The absolute silence in the boardroom was so profound, I could hear the faint rhythmic hum of the building's central air conditioning system. Trent's words hung in the sterile, chilled air, a toxic cloud of admission that permanently altered the atmosphere. He had just casually offered up my father's freedom, tossing Calvin directly into the line of federal fire just to save his own skin. It was a spectacular display of cowardice, completely stripping away the polished, arrogant facade of the wealthy real estate mogul. Trent was nothing but a cornered animal willing to gnaw off his own leg, or in this case his father-in-law's entire future, to escape the trap. Calvin staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. The back of his knees hit one of the plush leather executive chairs, and he collapsed into it. He did not sit. His legs simply ceased to function. His mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, pulling in harsh, ragged gasps of air. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently beneath his cheap department store suit. The deep crimson flush of his previous anger had completely vanished, replaced by a sickly, translucent shade of gray. "You told her," Calvin gasped, staring at Trent with wide, horrified eyes. "You swore to me that the collateral documentation was entirely buried. You looked me in the eye and swore the bridge loan was a temporary invisible maneuver. You promised me a guaranteed 80% yield on the warehouse project by the end of the fiscal quarter." Trent did not even have the basic decency to look apologetic. He just sneered aggressively, running a hand through his sweat-slicked hair. "I did what I had to do to secure the capital." "Calvin." Trent spat, his voice defensive and shrill. "You are the one who signed the pension transfer. You are the one who forged Vivian's signature on the second mortgage deed. Do not act like you are an innocent victim here. You wanted the massive returns to secure your own early retirement. You took the risk. Now tell your daughter to authorize my joint venture funding so we can all walk out of this room as free men." Calvin's head snapped toward me. The transition from arrogant, abusive patriarch to a desperate, groveling beggar was instantaneous and entirely revolting. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white as he tried to pull himself forward. Large beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he did not dare reach up to wipe them away. He looked up at me from the chair, entirely stripped of his unearned authority. "Kendra, you have to listen to me," Calvin pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have to sign his paperwork. You heard what he just said. If you do not approve this funding, the bank is going to instantly call in the default. They are going to trigger the collateral clauses today." I remained perfectly still in my chair at the head of the table. I did not lean forward. I did not frown. I simply observed his utter collapse with the detached, clinical fascination of a scientist recording a chemical reaction. "You cannot let this happen, Kendra." Calvin continued, his breathing growing even more erratic. "If that loan defaults, I lose my entire corporate pension. 30 years of my life entirely erased. But it is not just me. It is your mother. I leveraged the house. I used the Fairfield estate as a secondary guarantee. If you reject Trent's pitch, the bank will seize the property. Your mother will be thrown out onto the street. You cannot do that to Vivian. You cannot do that to your own mother." He was actually attempting to use the woman he had just defrauded as a human shield. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. "We are blood." "Kendra," Calvin begged, his voice dripping with a sickening manufactured warmth. "Family protects family. I know I have been hard on you over the years. I know I pushed you. I was tough on you, but you have to understand it was only because I saw this potential inside of you. I was preparing you for the real world. I made you strong so you could achieve exactly this level of success. You are sitting in the CEO's chair now. You have the power to save us. This is your moment to prove your loyalty to this family. Just authorize the capital transfer, please. I am begging you as your father." I let his pathetic, desperate words echo against the glass walls of the boardroom. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to sit in the suffocating weight of his own begging. I looked at Trent, who was nodding vigorously, completely aligned with the man he had just threatened with federal prison. They were both united in their absolute conviction that my lifelong conditioning to serve them would somehow override my business acumen. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. Yelling requires an emotional investment, and I had completely divested from these men years ago. Your tough love did not build my empire, Calvin, I said, my voice carrying the smooth, icy precision of a scalpel. You did not prepare me for the real world. You actively attempted to destroy my confidence at every conceivable opportunity to ensure you remained the most powerful person in a very small, very pathetic pond. You demanded blind loyalty while offering absolute betrayal. You stole from your own wife to fund a grifter. Family does not commit federal wire fraud, Calvin. I slowly turned my gaze toward Olivia, who was standing silently behind my right shoulder. She did not need a verbal command. She understood the precise choreography of this execution. Olivia reached down into her leather briefcase. She pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. It was bound in dark blue linen, completely unmarked yet carrying the undeniable weight of absolute corporate destruction. She stepped forward and placed it directly in front of me on the table. I placed my manicured fingertips on the top of the folder. With a single deliberate motion, I slid it across the long stretch of polished mahogany. It glided smoothly, the friction creating a low, satisfying hiss, until it stopped exactly 1 inch away from Calvin's trembling hands. Calvin stared at the blue linen cover as if it were an active explosive device. He did not dare touch it. Trent leaned over, his eyes narrowing in terrified suspicion. "What is this?" Trent demanded, his voice shaking. "What are you doing?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "You clearly failed to perform standard due diligence regarding the nature of my firm, Trent," I stated, maintaining my unbroken lethal composure. Apex Acquisitions does not simply purchase successful corporations. Our primary business model is the aggressive acquisition of highly distressed assets. We specialize in buying out toxic, unrecoverable debt from major banking institutions at a steep discount, and then we aggressively liquidate the collateral for a massive profit. Trent's breath hitched in his throat. His eyes darted from the folder to my face, the horrific realization finally crashing through his dense skull. When my analysts were mapping the acquisition of Sterling Holdings, I explained smoothly, we naturally conducted a full forensic audit of all senior executive compensation packages, including corporate pensions. We flagged a highly irregular, completely illegal encumbrance on Calvin's retirement account. We traced that encumbrance directly back to your primary lender, Trent. Calvin let out a soft, whimpering sound, finally reaching out with a shaking hand to flip open the heavy cover of the blue folder. Your bank was absolutely thrilled to offload your toxic defaulting bridge loan. I continued, my voice echoing with final, irreversible authority. They knew you were entirely insolvent. They sold the paper for pennies on the dollar, just to clear it off their books before the federal regulators caught wind of the fraudulent signatures. Calvin stared at the top document inside the folder. It was a formal notice of debt transfer stamped with the official seal of the State Banking Commission. The assignee listed at the top of the page was Apex Acquisitions. I did not just buy Sterling Holdings today, I said, watching the last remaining drop of hope evaporate from their eyes. My firm bought your entire portfolio of toxic bank debt. I am your sole creditor, Trent. And because of the wildly illegal collateral agreements your father-in-law signed to secure that specific loan, I now hold the absolute irrevocable deed to Calvin and Vivian's house. The heavy oak front door of my parents' sprawling Fairfield estate was unlocked, a clear indication that they were expecting an audience. I pushed it open and stepped onto the polished imported hardwood of the foyer. The house was a towering monument to my father's desperate lifelong need to project an image of absolute wealth. It featured vaulted ceilings, expansive custom windows, and crystal chandeliers that cast a harsh, unforgiving light on everything beneath them. It was the exact same house I had spent my entire childhood trying to shrink inside of, constantly hoping to avoid the crosshairs of my mother's relentless, agonizing criticism. Tonight the air was thick with the scent of expensive catered hors d'oeuvres and manufactured outrage. The moment I walked down the 2 shallow steps into the sunken living room, the ambient hushed chatter ceased instantly. My mother, Vivian, had assembled her audience perfectly. My Aunt Beatrice, Uncle Richard, Cousin Margaret, and several other extended family members who had made a spectator sport out of pitying my unmarried, supposedly unsuccessful existence were all perched on the custom-upholstered furniture. They sat in a deliberate semicircle looking at me like a highly judgmental jury preparing to deliver a guilty verdict on my life choices. My father was seated in the darkest, furthest corner of the room, clutching a heavy crystal tumbler filled to the brim with straight scotch. He looked completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the floorboards, absolutely refusing to lift his head and meet my eye. He knew exactly what was coming. "There she is," Vivian announced, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated theatricality as she stood in the center of the Persian rug. The woman who decided to destroy her own flesh and blood out of pure, bitter spite. I stopped at the edge of the room, my posture perfectly straight, gripping the reinforced handle of my leather briefcase. "I am assuming this emergency family meeting was your idea, Vivian," I asked, keeping my tone entirely flat and conversational. Vivian marched towards me, her face flushed with righteous indignation, her expensive silk wrap pulled tightly around her shoulders. She launched right into the spectacular narrative she had clearly been spinning for the last hour. "Do not use that condescending tone with me in my own home," Vivian snapped, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "Calvin told us everything that happened in the lobby today. He told us about the disgusting psychotic stunt you pulled. We know you do not own any acquisition firm, Kendra. We know you are a pathetic, unemployed spinster who manipulated some senile executive or hacked into a corporate database just to create fake documents. You committed corporate espionage to ruin your sister's perfect marriage because you are so consumed by jealousy it has made you literally insane." Right on cue, Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic sob. She was curled up on the pristine white sofa, burying her face in a handful of tissues, her shoulders heaving with the effort of her performance. "Trent is completely devastated," Jasmine cried to the captive audience of aunts and uncles, peeking out from behind her hands to ensure everyone was watching her. "He has worked day and night to build his commercial real estate portfolio. He was finally getting his massive breakthrough today. And Kendra shows up with forged papers and fake titles just to humiliate him in front of the board of directors. She sabotaged his multi-million-dollar pitch. She just wants to take everything from me because no man will ever look at her." Aunt Beatrice sighed heavily, shaking her head and adjusting the string of pearls around her neck. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of disgust and faux sympathy. "We always knew you struggled with your sister's happiness," Kendra Beatrice murmured. "It is hard being the older, unmarried sibling when the younger one gets everything right in life. We tried to be patient with your lack of ambition, but committing corporate fraud, threatening your father's pension with fake takeover documents, this goes beyond jealousy. You need to be in a secure psychiatric facility, not a boardroom." I looked over at Calvin. He took another long, desperate swallow of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. He could have stopped this entire charade. He could have looked his wife and his sister-in-law in the eye and told them the absolute truth. He could have confessed that Trent's money was completely gone, that the commercial portfolio was a total fraud, and that the only reason they were not currently packing their belongings into garbage bags was because the daughter they despised had bought their toxic debt. But his cowardice was absolute. He was actively letting Vivian attack me, hoping somehow miraculously that the sheer weight of their collective family gaslighting would force me to back down and cover his tracks. "You live in a one-bedroom apartment," Vivian sneered, stepping closer, emboldened by the supportive murmurs of the extended family. "You drive a 5-year-old car. You have nothing, and you think you can walk into Sterling Holdings and pretend to be a billionaire. You are going to federal prison for this, Kendra. The police are going to drag you out of here in handcuffs." The absolute staggering delusion in the room was almost suffocating. They were so deeply committed to the narrative of my failure that they would rather believe I had masterminded an impossible international corporate cybercrime than simply admit I had outworked, outsmarted, and outperformed all of them combined. "You will call Elias Sterling right now," Vivian demanded, her voice rising to a shrill command. "You will confess to this deranged hoax. You will formally apologize to Trent for trying to ruin his business, and you will pack your bags and leave this state. We are done hiding your failures. We are done pretending you are a functioning member of society. Fix what you broke right now. I let her final echoing demand fade into the heavy silence of the living room. I looked at the smug faces of my aunts and uncles. I looked at Jasmine's fake tears. I looked at my father's pathetic, trembling hands. I did not yell over their screaming. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I simply stepped forward, walked directly over to the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the room, and set my leather briefcase down upon it. I calmly unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a massive, heavily bound stack of printed financial receipts. I did not just bring one single copy for my parents. I brought meticulously organized, fully authenticated financial dossiers for every single judgmental relative currently sitting in my mother's living room. I picked up the first thick stack of papers bound with a heavy binder clip and dropped it onto the glass coffee table right in front of Aunt Beatrice. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. I handed the next packet to Uncle Richard, then one to Cousin Margaret, moving around the semicircle with the calm, methodical precision of a dealer handing out cards at a high-stakes casino. Vivian stopped mid-rant, her mouth hanging open. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, snatching a packet from Margaret's hands. I stepped back to the center of the room, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket. "Those are not corporate espionage documents, Vivian," I said clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the farthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. "Those are the fully certified, deeply tragic financial realities of your golden child and her perfect husband. I suggest you all flip to page 3. Uncle Richard was the first to open his folder. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the top sheet. Within seconds, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. "Wait a minute," Richard muttered, tracing a line with his finger. "This shows a massive series of wire transfers. 18 transfers in the last 6 months, routing directly from Calvin's corporate retirement account into a Delaware LLC. "Yes, Uncle Richard," I replied smoothly. "And if you cross-reference that LLC on page 4, you will see it is registered entirely in Trent's name." Jasmine bolted upright on the white sofa, her fake tears vanishing instantly. "Shut up," Jasmine shrieked, lunging forward as if she could physically snatch the papers out of everyone's hands. "You do not know what you are looking at. Those are fabricated. You are printing fake bank statements to ruin me." I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes fixed on the extended family who had spent decades pitying me. "Flip to page 7, I instructed. "You will see a detailed ledger of Jasmine's credit card statements. Aunt Beatrice, you always complimented Jasmine on her incredible lifestyle influencer aesthetic. You always marveled at how she managed to afford those spontaneous trips to Milan, the endless supply of Chanel bags, and that brand new Mercedes she parked in your driveway last Thanksgiving." Beatrice looked up from the paper, her face draining of color as the mathematical reality set in. "She maxed out 6 different platinum cards," Beatrice whispered, genuine shock replacing her usual condescending tone. "And the minimum payments were being covered by Vivian's home equity line of credit." Vivian gasped, dropping the folder onto the floor. She spun around to look at Calvin, who had shrunk even further into his dark corner, clutching his Scotch glass like a lifeline. "Calvin, what is this?" Vivian demanded, her voice cracking. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them you did not touch the house." Calvin could not even look his wife in the eye. He just stared at the ice cubes melting in his glass, paralyzed by his own monumental cowardice. "He cannot tell you that, because it is the absolute truth," I stated, stepping closer to my mother. "You allowed Trent to completely drain your life savings to fund Jasmine's pathetic illusion of wealth. And the worst part is Trent is such a colossal failure that even with your stolen pension, he still could not keep his head above water." Flip to page 12. You will see the mortgage statements for Trent and Jasmine's beautiful suburban estate. They have not made a single mortgage payment in exactly 8 months. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. They are completely undeniably broke. The living room erupted into a chaotic chorus of gasping and hushed aggressive whispers. The aunts and uncles who had spent the last hour nodding along to my mother's toxic narrative were now staring at Vivian and Calvin, as if they had contracted a highly contagious disease. In our extended family, there was no sin greater than being poor, but being poor and stupid was an absolute unforgivable disgrace. "How could you be so utterly blind?" Uncle Richard barked, tossing the financial packet back onto the glass table with a look of pure disgust. "You let this smooth-talking grifter completely dismantle your finances. You remortgaged the family home to buy designer purses." I stood in the center of the room, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of liberation wash over me. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and laid out the exact truth they had spent my entire life trying to bury. "You worshipped him," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable clarity. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was crumpling under the weight of the family's sudden, brutal judgment. "You worshipped Trent's background. You worshipped his country club pedigree, his slick sales pitches, and his hollow promises. You wanted the aesthetic of a proper high society son-in-law so desperately that you completely ignored the massive glaring red flags. You handed over the keys to your entire future to a man who contributed absolutely nothing to society simply because his arrogant facade fit your narrative." I took a step closer to my father's dark corner. "And while you were busy bankrolling a massive fraud, you treated your own brilliant, hardworking black daughter like absolute dirt," I said, my words echoing in the silent house. "You mocked my ambition. You belittled my career. You told me I was a disappointment because I was not conforming to your pathetic, outdated standards of success. I built a multi-million-dollar private equity firm from the ground up entirely on my own, while you were busy liquidating your retirement to buy fake luxury for a daughter who brings nothing to the table." Aunt Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh, her allegiance shifting with the speed of a seasoned opportunist. "Well," Vivian Beatrice said, sipping her wine with a newfound vicious superiority, "it seems your golden child is nothing but a highly subsidized charity case. To think you sat here lecturing us about Kendra's jealousy when you are practically facing eviction. It is actually quite embarrassing for you." Vivian opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. She looked around the room, realizing with absolute horror that she had entirely lost her audience. The people she had gathered to humiliate me were now feasting on her spectacular downfall. The social standing she had spent her entire life meticulously cultivating was completely gone, reduced to ash by cold, hard bank statements. Jasmine could feel the temperature in the room plummeting. She saw the judgmental stares of our relatives burning into her. She saw her fake influencer lifestyle evaporating into the reality of impending foreclosure. The carefully constructed illusion of her superiority was dead, and she was backed firmly into a corner with absolutely nowhere left to run. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly entitlement. She threw her damp tissues onto the floor and stood up on the white sofa, looking down at everyone with wild, frantic eyes. "I deserve that money!" Jasmine screamed, her voice tearing through the room like shattered glass. "Do you hear me? I deserve every single penny Dad gave us. I am the only one who actually played by the rules. I gave you the proper wedding. I gave you the right kind of son-in-law. I am the only one who gave you the aesthetic you wanted, and I am the only one who gave you grandchildren." Jasmine stood on the pristine white sofa, her chest heaving, her tear-stained face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. Her desperate scream about giving our parents a proper marriage and the right kind of son-in-law echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the Fairfield estate. I did not interrupt her. I let her finish. I let her claim her perfect superior life one last time in front of the very people she was trying to impress. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen 3 times, navigating directly to the Sterling family group chat, a massive thread I had been forcibly added to years ago and had kept permanently muted ever since. I selected a large encrypted PDF file, hit the send button, and slid the phone back into my pocket without breaking eye contact with my sister. A second later, a synchronized, chaotic chorus of chimes, pings, and buzzing erupted across the living room. Every single aunt, uncle, and cousin reached into their pockets or purses simultaneously. Aunt Beatrice pulled out her phone, adjusting her designer reading glasses. Uncle Richard frowned at his brightly lit screen. Vivian and Calvin, still frozen in their respective states of shock from the paper receipts I had just handed out, slowly looked down at their devices. Jasmine scrambled off the sofa, snatching her phone from the glass coffee table with trembling fingers. "Since you are so incredibly proud of your proper marriage, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm and perfectly level, "I thought the entire extended family should see exactly what kind of partnership you have been maintaining." Jasmine stared at her screen, her eyes darting back and forth rapidly as she opened the file. Her breathing stopped entirely. "When my firm bought Trent's toxic debt this afternoon," I explained, pacing slowly across the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. "We legally acquired all communications associated with the collateralized accounts during standard corporate discovery. It is an entirely routine operating procedure when taking over distressed assets. What is not routine is what my forensic analysts found hiding in Trent's deleted server folders." Aunt Beatrice let out a sharp, audible gasp. "Oh my word," she whispered, scrolling furiously on her phone. I looked directly at Trent. He had gone perfectly rigid. The defensive, arrogant posture he had been desperately trying to maintain in front of the family completely evaporated. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost trapped under the crystal chandeliers. "You are all currently looking at a verified chain of emails between Trent and a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands." I continued, making sure every single word landed like a physical blow. "While Calvin and Vivian were busy liquidating their life savings, committing federal wire fraud, and mortgaging this very house to keep Trent's fake real estate empire afloat, Trent was not putting that money into his business. He was aggressively routing 80% of your stolen pension directly into a secure, untraceable offshore account." Calvin let out a sound that was half sob, half choke. He looked at Trent with a terrifying mixture of ultimate betrayal and absolute despair. "You stole it," Calvin whispered. His hands shaking so violently, his scotch spilled over the rim of his glass and onto the expensive rug. "You were supposed to be saving the warehouse project. You swore to me." "There is no warehouse project, Calvin," I snapped, refusing to let him play the victim for even a second. "There is only Trent's exit strategy. Scroll down to page 4, everyone. Let us look at the rest of Trent's master plan." The room went dead silent as 20 pairs of eyes swiped down on their glowing screens. The heavy silence was instantly shattered by a loud, piercing shriek from Jasmine. She dropped her phone as if the metal had physically burned her hands, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. "Trent," Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking in pure, unimaginable horror. "Tell me this is fake. Tell me she forged this. Tell me you did not write this." Trent did not look at her. He stared at the floorboards, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He was sweating profusely, trapped in the inescapable spotlight of his own monumental greed. "He cannot tell you that, Jasmine," I said, turning to face my sister directly, "because those are verified, legally obtained emails between your perfect husband and a high-end divorce attorney located in Manhattan." I stepped closer to the glass coffee table, commanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. "Trent has been consulting with this elite legal team for the past 3 months," I announced. "He has been systematically hiding assets, transferring offshore funds, and legally isolating himself from the massive fraudulent debt he created. His plan was incredibly simple and utterly ruthless. He was going to drain Calvin's pension, leverage this house to the absolute maximum, funnel the cash out of the country, and then serve you with divorce papers the exact moment the bank initiated foreclosure." Jasmine shook her head frantically, pressing her hands violently against her ears, as if she could physically block out the sound of my voice. "No," Jasmine sobbed, her pristine influencer makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "No, we are building a life. We are buying a summer house. He loves me." I pulled out a single sheet of paper from my briefcase and read directly from Trent's own outgoing email. "I need this filed by the end of the fiscal quarter," Trent wrote to his lawyer. "She is completely clueless about the finances. Her parents are covering the minimums on her platinum credit cards anyway. Let her keep the leased Mercedes and leave her holding the bag for the defaulted mortgage. I am flying out the day the papers are served. Do not let them trace the Cayman routing numbers. I dropped the paper onto the glass table. It landed right next to the massive stack of unpaid bills and foreclosure notices. Your perfect marriage is a total sham, Jasmine, I said, my voice cold and surgical. You did not give our parents a proper son-in-law. You gave them a financial parasite who used your desperate need for aesthetic validation to rob them completely blind. He was going to leave you entirely destitute, utterly humiliated, and legally responsible for millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. You played by their toxic rules your entire life, and your grand prize is absolute bankruptcy. The extended family was completely paralyzed. Uncle Richard looked at Trent with a level of absolute disgust he usually reserved for criminals on the evening news. Aunt Beatrice was gripping her pearls, staring at Jasmine with a look of pure, unvarnished pity. It was the exact same condescending pity they had all weaponized against me for my entire adult life, now squarely aimed at the golden child. Vivian finally broke the suffocating silence. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream and lunged across the living room toward Trent. "You absolute monster!" Vivian shrieked, her perfectly manicured hands curling into violent claws. "We gave you everything. We treated you like a king. You were going to leave my daughter with nothing. You were going to let us lose our home." Uncle Richard stepped forward rapidly, grabbing Vivian by the shoulders and pulling her back before she could physically attack him. Trent stumbled backward, his arms raised defensively, nearly tripping over an expensive floor lamp. Trent looked wildly around the room. He saw the furious, judgmental faces of the aunts and uncles who had praised him an hour ago. He saw Calvin slumped in the dark corner, a broken shell of a man facing federal prison. He saw Jasmine sliding down the wall, sobbing hysterically as her entire identity crumbled into meaningless dust. And he saw me standing perfectly calm in the center of the wreckage, holding the absolute power over his future. The reality of his situation finally hit him. His secret offshore accounts were entirely frozen because I owned the debt. His fraud was exposed to the entire family. His meticulous exit strategy was completely destroyed. He was trapped. "You are all crazy," Trent barked, his voice rising to a frantic, panicked pitch as he backed away from the family. "This is a setup. This whole family is completely insane. I am not staying here for this. You can all rot." He spun around aggressively, shoving past Uncle Richard and knocking a decorative side table to the floor with a loud crash. He did not care about the broken glass or the screaming relatives. He was in full survival mode. Trent bolted down the hallway, his heavy leather shoes echoing loudly against the imported hardwood floor. He was abandoning his wife, abandoning his in-laws, and desperately trying to run from the catastrophic consequences of his own spectacular greed. Trent reached the grand foyer and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front oak door. He yanked it open violently, preparing to sprint down the long circular driveway and disappear into the night. He stepped over the threshold and stopped dead in his tracks. He did not run. He did not move forward. He just stood entirely frozen in the open doorway, the cool night air rushing into the suffocating, tense atmosphere of the house. Parked directly across the circular driveway, completely blocking his escape route, was a massive black armored SUV. The high-beam headlights were glaring brightly, cutting sharply through the darkness and illuminating Trent's terrified, pale face. Standing directly in front of the vehicle, perfectly silhouetted by the harsh lights and holding their hands neatly folded in front of them, were three large men wearing tailored black suits and discreet communication earpieces. The man standing in the center of the illuminated driveway stepped forward. He did not look like a standard security guard or a hired thug. He looked exactly like what he was, a highly paid, relentlessly efficient corporate fixer. Behind him, the rear passenger doors of the armored SUV opened simultaneously, and two figures emerged into the cool night air, carrying thick, leather-bound briefcases. These were not local police officers responding to a domestic disturbance. These were my lead corporate litigators, Marcus and Elena. Trent took a staggering, unsteady step backward into the grand foyer as Marcus smoothly bypassed the security detail and stepped over the threshold of the house. Marcus extended a thick sealed manila envelope directly toward Trent's chest. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been formally notified of the highly irregular fraudulent wire transfers regarding the Sterling Holdings corporate pension accounts. Marcus stated, his voice carrying the sterile, devastating authority of a federal indictment. Your Cayman Island routing numbers have been completely flagged by the International Banking Authority, and global freeze orders are currently being executed across all of your hidden accounts. You are legally restricted from leaving the state of Connecticut, and any attempt to board an international or domestic flight will result in your immediate detainment by federal authorities. Trent stared at the manila envelope as if it were coated in lethal radiation. He did not reach out to take it. Marcus simply let his hand drop, allowing the heavy packet to fall. It landed with a definitive echoing slap on the imported hardwood floor, resting right at the tips of Trent's expensive unpaid-for Italian loafers. Elena stepped up directly next to Marcus, her expression entirely devoid of anything resembling human sympathy. "We strongly suggest you return to the living room, Mr. Blackwood," Elena said, her tone sharp and precise. "Fleeing the scene of an active multi-million-dollar corporate fraud investigation will only serve to expedite your federal arrest warrant." Trent was completely, utterly broken. The manic, desperate energy that had fueled his attempted escape completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, trembling shell of a man who had finally run out of lies. He slowly turned around and dragged his feet back down the long hallway, escorted by my legal team like a condemned prisoner taking his final walk to the execution chamber. When Trent reappeared in the sunken living room, heavily flanked by Marcus and Elena, the last remaining embers of defiance in my parents were instantly and violently extinguished. Calvin looked up from his dark corner, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the official SEC insignia visibly printed on the folders Elena was holding. He knew exactly what that crest meant. Federal regulators were no longer an abstract threat or a rumor. They were an active, impending reality standing in his living room. Vivian stared at the security personnel who had quietly followed the lawyers inside, taking up tactical positions at the perimeter of the room to ensure no one else attempted a frantic exit. The absolute terrifying reality of the situation finally settled over the Fairfield estate like a suffocating shroud. I did not just have the printed bank statements, I had the institutional legal power to enforce them. They were entirely at my mercy. I owned the toxic debt I held, the absolute deed to the house, and my ruthless legal team held the keys to their continued freedom. The aunts and uncles, instantly sensing the catastrophic, irreversible shift in power, began subtly edging toward the coat closet in the hallway. They were desperate to separate themselves from the blast radius of Calvin and Vivian's impending destruction. Aunt Beatrice suddenly found the intricate woven pattern of the Persian rug absolutely fascinating, completely refusing to make eye contact with the sister she had been blindly defending just 10 minutes ago. The loyalty of the extended family was entirely conditional, evaporating the exact second the money ran out. Vivian looked around at her rapidly crumbling empire. Her husband was facing imminent prison time, her golden son-in-law was a confirmed federal criminal, and her favorite daughter was sobbing uncontrollably on the white sofa, mourning the permanent loss of a fake luxury lifestyle. Vivian realized with chilling clarity that anger, intimidation, and social pressure were completely useless weapons against a woman who literally held the deed to her house. So she did what ultimate unrepentant narcissists always do when they are backed firmly into a corner. She pivoted. The vicious vitriol and screeching rage melted away from her face, instantly replaced by a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured expression of maternal awe. Vivian took a slow, deliberate step toward me, clasping her hands tightly together against her chest. Tears began welling in her eyes, but these were entirely different from the tears of rage she had shed moments ago. These were tears of immense fabricated pride. "Oh, Kendra," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifyingly convincing emotional resonance. "Look at you. Just look at what you have built. Look at the incredible power you command." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting on my briefcase, watching the grotesque performance unfold with absolute clinical disgust. I always knew you had this extraordinary potential inside of you. Vivian continued, taking another tentative step forward, acting as if the vicious, degrading insults she had hurled at me 10 minutes ago had simply never happened. We always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. Do you not see it now? Do you not understand what we were doing all these years? Calvin, sensing the desperate new strategy, slowly lifted his head. He cleared his throat frantically, trying to summon the patriarchal warmth and wisdom he had entirely faked for his entire life. Your mother is exactly right, Kendra. Calvin croaked, his voice raw and pathetic. We had to be hard on you. We had to push you to your absolute limits. Vivian reached out, attempting to place her trembling hand on my arm. I took a sharp, immediate step back, and she let her hand fall to her side, undeterred in her sweeping delusion. We demanded pure perfection from you because we knew the world would demand perfection from you. Vivian pleaded, her eyes wide with desperate, cloying sincerity. We made you tough. We gave you the fire, the relentless drive to go out there and conquer the corporate world. If we had coddled you, if we had babied you the way we babied Jasmine, you would never have built a multi-million-dollar firm. You would never be standing here holding all the cards. You are a titan, Kendra. And you are a titan entirely because we shaped you into one. We gave you the grit to succeed against all odds. You should be thanking us for making you this strong. They were actually trying to take credit for my empire. They were actively attempting to rebrand 30 years of emotional abuse, blatant neglect, and psychological torture as a masterclass in elite visionary parenting. They wanted to claim my trauma as the foundational bedrock of their success. I looked at Vivian, and then I looked at Calvin. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their gaslighting was almost blinding, but it did not disorient me. It only sharpened my focus into a lethal point. I let out a low, humorless laugh that cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. It was a cold, sharp sound that made Vivian physically flinch and step back. You do not get to claim my survival as your parenting victory, Vivian. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced every single person in the room to lean in and listen. You did not push me toward greatness. You actively tried to bury me. And let us be absolutely clear about exactly why you tried to bury me. Let us finally drag the real ugly truth out into the light right here in front of all these relatives who happily enabled your delusions. I turned to look directly at Trent, who was sweating and hyperventilating near the foyer, and then snapped my gaze back to my parents. You worshipped Trent the very second he walked through this front door, I stated, pointing a steady finger directly at the terrified fraud. You happily threw your money, your pension, and your entire family reputation at him because he perfectly fit your pathetic internalized standard of success. He was a smooth-talking country club-educated white man with a superficial charm and a completely manufactured pedigree. You were so deeply blinded by his proximity to the kind of traditional wealthy whiteness you have spent your entire lives desperately trying to emulate that you completely ignored the glaring fact that he was a staggeringly incompetent, mediocre grifter. You handed him millions of dollars without a single second thought because his aesthetic made you feel like you had finally arrived in high society. I stepped closer to Vivian, forcing her to look me directly in the eye, refusing to let her look away from the mirror I was holding up. And while you were blindly funding his white mediocrity, you were aggressively punishing my black excellence. I said, my words striking the air like physical heavy blows. You completely despise the fact that I did not conform to your respectable, quiet, subservient ideal. You hated my natural hair. You hated my loud, unapologetic ambition, and you absolutely hated that I refused to shrink myself to make your prejudiced country club friends feel comfortable. Your treatment of me was not tough love, Vivian. It was toxic, deeply internalized anti-blackness. You projected every single one of your own racial insecurities directly onto me, tearing me down, because my relentless brilliance threatened the safe, assimilated little bubble you built for yourselves in this sterile suburb. I looked around the room, making sure my aunts and uncles heard every single syllable. You did not give me grit, I finalized, my voice echoing with absolute authority. You gave me scars. I succeeded in absolute spite of you, not because of you. I built a private equity empire to specifically insulate myself from the exact brand of toxic self-hating destruction you just brought down upon your own heads. Do not ever for the rest of your miserable, bankrupt lives attempt to take credit for the crown I built with my own bleeding hands while you were busy buying a fake throne for a con artist. The aunts and uncles did not say a single word. They did not offer a comforting pat on the shoulder to Vivian, nor did they cast a sympathetic glance toward Calvin. Like rats fleeing a rapidly sinking luxury cruise liner, they simply grabbed their expensive coats from the hall closet and scurried out the front door. They kept their heads down, maneuvering carefully around the federal lawyers and the imposing corporate security detail blocking the driveway. The sound of their luxury sedans starting up and speeding away down the street was the final nail in the coffin of my parents' carefully curated social standing. They were officially pariahs in their own gated community. The vast, sunken living room was now empty of spectators, leaving only the raw, ugly reality of the people who had created this disaster. My mother stood completely paralyzed, her hands trembling by her sides, the manufactured tears drying on her cheeks, as she realized her manipulative performance had completely failed. My father remained slumped in the shadows, staring at the floorboards as if praying they would open up and swallow him whole. Jasmine was a crumpled, sobbing mess on the sofa while Trent stood frozen near the foyer, boxed in by my legal team. I sat down slowly on the edge of a custom-upholstered armchair directly facing my parents. I rested my leather briefcase on my knees and unzipped the final compartment. I pulled out a fresh, cleanly printed legal document, 50 pages thick, bound by a heavy black spine. I set it gently onto the glass coffee table. "You have exactly 2 options tonight, Calvin," I said, my voice carrying the calm, reasonable tone of a woman ordering a cup of coffee. "Option 1 is that my lawyers, standing in the hallway, immediately transmit the full, unredacted corporate discovery file to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the State Banking Authority. By tomorrow morning, your assets will be completely frozen, your pension will be liquidated to cover the bank penalties, and you will be facing a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud." Calvin let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, his hands flying up to cover his face. Vivian let out a sharp cry, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. Option 2. I continued tapping the thick legal document with one manicured fingernail. "Is that you sign this surrender agreement. If you sign this, my firm absorbs the entirety of the toxic debt, we halt the federal transmission, and we keep you out of a prison cell. But you will agree to my terms, and my terms are absolute, non-negotiable, and permanently binding." Calvin practically threw himself out of his chair, scrambling across the Persian rug. He grabbed a gold-plated pen from the side table with violently shaking hands. "I will sign it." Calvin rushed, his voice breaking in sheer panic. "I will sign whatever you want, Kendra. Just give me the pen. I agree to everything. You should probably hear the terms before you sign away your remaining dignity." "Calvin," I said coldly, pulling the document slightly out of his desperate reach. "First, this house no longer belongs to you. You leveraged the deed and I bought the debt. However, I have absolutely no interest in becoming a landlord to my own parents, nor do I want the public spectacle of evicting you. Therefore, the Fairfield estate is going into a blind corporate trust entirely controlled by Apex Acquisitions. You and Vivian are permitted to continue living here, but you are now classified as tenants. You own nothing." Vivian gasped, her eyes widening in pure horror. "A tenant!" Vivian shrieked, her pride momentarily overriding her terror. "In my own home, I designed this house, Kendra. I picked out every fixture. You cannot strip my name off the deed. My friends come here for charity galas. Your friends just ran to their cars to escape association with a federal criminal." "Vivian," I shot back, silencing her instantly. "You do not have friends anymore. You have a roof over your head strictly because I am allowing it." I turned my attention back to Calvin, who was nodding frantically, willing to accept any humiliation to avoid prison. Second, I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "You will draft a formal immediate letter of resignation to the board of Sterling Holdings tonight. You are stepping down as CEO effective tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. You will cite sudden severe health issues. Your corporate career is permanently over, Calvin. You are entering an unglamorous mandatory early retirement. Calvin squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek as he realized his 30 years of corporate dominance had just been vaporized in an instant. Yes, Calvin whispered, his voice entirely defeated. I will resign. Third, and most importantly, I said, leaning forward to ensure they absorbed every single syllable. Your finances are now entirely under the direct, unyielding control of my executive assistant, Olivia. You no longer have access to independent banking. You no longer have credit cards. Olivia will dispense a strict, modest monthly allowance to cover your basic utilities, groceries, and property maintenance. There will be no country club memberships. There will be no luxury car leases. There will be no spontaneous shopping sprees in Manhattan. You will live on the exact, meticulously calculated budget that my firm provides. If you attempt to open a secret line of credit, if you attempt to sell off the furniture, or if you violate the terms of this financial probation in any way, the blind trust will instantly evict you, and the federal charges will be immediately reactivated. Vivian looked as though she was going to physically vomit. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her mind desperately trying to process a reality where she had to ask my assistant for permission to buy groceries. The absolute control she had lorded over me for my entire childhood was now completely inverted. She was entirely at my mercy, trapped in a financial prison of her own making. Calvin did not hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbed the pen, and began frantically signing his name on every single page. I indicated his signature, a jagged, messy scrawl of pure desperation. Vivian stood frozen, watching her husband sign away their entire kingdom in exchange for a modest, strictly monitored allowance. When Calvin finished the final page, he dropped the pen, burying his face in his hands and sobbing openly. I calmly gathered the papers, checking each signature with surgical precision, and slipped them back into my leather briefcase. There is one final non-negotiable condition, I announced, zipping the briefcase shut. I stood up and turned around to face the back of the room. Jasmine was still sitting on the sofa, her makeup completely ruined, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Trent was standing perfectly still near the foyer, his face a mask of pale, sweating dread. Trent and Jasmine are permanently cut off from this family's resources, I declared, my voice ringing like a judge pronouncing a final sentence. They will not receive a single dime from the monthly allowance. Calvin, you are legally barred from funneling any money to them, and Olivia will be auditing the accounts weekly to ensure absolute compliance. Furthermore, Trent and Jasmine will vacate these premises within 24 hours. You are entirely on your own. The words hit Jasmine like a physical shockwave. She shot up from the sofa, her mouth opening in a silent scream before the actual sound ripped from her throat. It was a terrifying guttural noise, the sound of a spoiled, entitled child realizing that the infinite bank account had just been permanently closed. No! Jasmine shrieked, launching herself across the room and grabbing a handful of Vivian's silk wrap. Mom, you cannot let her do this. You have to fight her. You have to hire lawyers. Tell her no. Tell her I need my money. I am your daughter. You have to protect me. Jasmine clung to Vivian, sobbing hysterically, digging her nails into her mother's arms. She was absolutely convinced that the ancient family dynamic would hold. She assumed that Vivian would sacrifice everything, including her own freedom and shelter, to protect the precious golden child. Jasmine expected Vivian to scream at me, to demand that I change the contract, to throw herself on the sword for her favorite daughter. But Vivian did not scream at me. Vivian looked down at Jasmine's hands clutching her wrap. She looked at Trent, the mediocre fraud who had nearly sent her husband to a federal penitentiary. Then she looked at the heavy leather briefcase in my hand, the briefcase that held the only document keeping a roof over her head. The cold, calculating machinery of a lifelong narcissist was operating at absolute maximum capacity in Vivian's mind. She weighed the value of her golden child against the terrifying reality of absolute homelessness and public disgrace. Self-preservation won. It always does with people like them. Vivian reached down and wrapped her hands around Jasmine's wrists. With slow, deliberate, and chillingly cold force, Vivian pried Jasmine's fingers off her arm. Jasmine gasped, stumbling backward, staring at her mother in complete disbelief. "Mom," Jasmine whispered, her voice shaking with a betrayal so profound it seemed to fracture her entire reality. "You have to leave." "Jasmine," Vivian said, her voice entirely devoid of maternal warmth, reduced to a hollow mechanical drone. "You brought this criminal into our home. You let him destroy our finances. Your father is resigning tomorrow. We have nothing left to give you. You have to pack your things and get out of my house." The ultimate toxic betrayal was finally complete. The unbreakable bond between the narcissistic mother and the golden child had snapped under the pressure of actual consequences. Jasmine stared at Vivian as if she were looking at a complete stranger. The absolute horror of rejection washed over her face, wiping away the entitlement and leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated panic. Jasmine spun around, her frantic eyes landing on Trent. It was a terrifying, instantaneous transition from sorrow to pure, vicious hatred. "This is your fault," Jasmine screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at her husband's face. "You promised me a commercial empire. You promised me millions. You are nothing but a pathetic, broke loser. You ruined my life." Trent, completely stripped of his country club charm and facing absolute financial ruin, snarled back at her like a cornered dog. "You ruined your own life, you spoiled, useless brat." "Trent," roared his voice, echoing violently in the foyer. "Do you think I actually wanted to deal with your insufferable family? Do you think I actually wanted to listen to you complain about your luxury aesthetic all day? I only married you for the sterling money. And now that the money is gone, you are absolutely nothing to me." Jasmine let out an ear-piercing shriek and lunged at him. Trent threw his hands up, shoving her backward. The explosive, violent energy between them reached a critical mass. They burst through the front door, stumbling out into the cool night air, their fake perfect marriage instantly dissolving into a chaotic screaming match on the manicured front lawn. Their vicious insults echoed down the quiet suburban street. Lights began flicking on in the neighboring houses. Expensive drapes were pulled back as the wealthy neighbors peeked out eagerly, watching the spectacular, humiliating destruction of the Sterling family legacy playing out right on the grass. I did not follow them outside. I did not raise my voice to join the screaming. I calmly adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase, ensuring the surrender documents were perfectly secure. I looked at Vivian, who was standing completely frozen in her ruined living room, and Calvin, who was still weeping quietly in his dark corner. They were prisoners in their own home, trapped by their own greed, entirely at the mercy of the daughter they had tried to destroy. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully out the front door. I strolled calmly down the circular driveway, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat against the pavement, walking directly past Trent and Jasmine, who were still screaming obscenities at each other in the grass. I did not even glance in their direction. Marcus and Elena stepped aside as I approached the armored black SUV. The corporate security guard opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather seat, setting my briefcase gently beside me. The guard closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly silencing the chaotic screaming outside. I leaned back into the comfortable seat, looked out the tinted window at the burning wreckage of the Sterling family empire, and told my driver to take me home. The morning sun over the Atlanta skyline always looked different from the vantage point of a corner office you built entirely with your own hands. 6 months had passed since that chaotic screaming night on the manicured front lawn of the Fairfield estate. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Apex Acquisitions, looking out over the sprawling city traffic far below. The glass was cool to the touch, and the office behind me was a sanctuary of absolute silence, structured efficiency, and unshakable control. The stark contrast between the humiliating, chaotic environment my family had forced me to endure for 30 years and the serene, powerful empire I had cultivated for myself was never more apparent than in the quiet moments of the early morning. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present reality. There was no more walking on eggshells. There was no more shrinking myself to accommodate the fragile, toxic egos of people who despised my ambition. There was only the steady, relentless hum of a multi-million-dollar private equity firm operating at peak capacity. The heavy mahogany door to my office opened with a soft click, and Olivia stepped inside. She was carrying her tablet, a sleek silver thermos of spring water, and a single slate gray folder. Over the past 6 months, Olivia had transitioned from being an exceptional executive assistant to an indispensable operational lieutenant. The quiet, commanding efficiency with which she managed my schedule was only matched by the ruthless precision with which she handled the Sterling family blind trust. She walked across the expansive room, her heels clicking softly against the polished concrete floor, and took her usual seat across from my massive desk. She placed the gray folder perfectly in the center of the glass surface. "Good morning, Kendra," Olivia said, her tone bright and purely professional. "The European market acquisitions have all cleared standard compliance, and the legal team has finalized the contracts for the new commercial real estate portfolio. Everything is operating exactly on schedule." "Excellent work, Olivia," I replied, walking over to my desk and taking my seat. I glanced at the gray folder. "And I assume that is the weekly compliance audit for the Fairfield Trust." Olivia offered a small, knowing smile. "It is indeed. I thought you might want the final quarterly updates before we head out this afternoon. The legal and financial transitions are entirely complete, and the natural consequences of your family's actions have settled into permanent reality." I leaned back in my leather chair, gesturing for her to open the folder. "Let us hear it," I said, feeling a profound sense of detachment. I was no longer emotionally tethered to the inevitable destruction they had brought upon themselves. I was simply the architect of their accountability. "Let us start with Trent." Olivia began tapping a specific document on her tablet. "The Securities and Exchange Commission investigation has moved from the discovery phase into active federal prosecution. Because your legal team provided them with the unredacted encrypted communications regarding his offshore Cayman accounts, the federal prosecutors completely dismantled his defense strategy. Every single one of his domestic and international assets remains entirely frozen by the global banking authority. He cannot access a single dime of the money he attempted to hide." I nodded slowly, picturing the arrogant country club grifter who had tried to humiliate me, and his current employment status. Olivia let out a soft, sharp exhale of amusement. "Because his assets are frozen and his high-priced Manhattan defense attorneys immediately dropped him. When the retainer bounced, he was forced to accept a court-appointed public defender. To satisfy the court's requirement for lawful employment while out on bail, Trent is currently working 40 hours a week at a regional logistics call center. He answers customer service complaints about delayed freight shipments. He makes exactly minimum wage, and 70% of his paycheck is instantly garnished to cover standard legal processing fees." The absolute poetry of a man who thought he was a financial titan being reduced to reading a scripted apology to angry truck drivers for minimum wage was not lost on me. "And Jasmine," I asked, shifting my focus to the sister who had assumed her white privilege by proxy would protect her forever. "The divorce proceedings are turning incredibly hostile," Olivia reported, pulling up a secondary document. "When you evicted them from the Fairfield estate and permanently cut off their access to Calvin's funds, their entire marriage dissolved into a mutual campaign of vicious accusations. Trent is actively trying to throw Jasmine under the bus, claiming she was complicit in the wire fraud to fund her lifestyle. Jasmine's legal representation is practically non-existent because she has absolutely no independent capital." "Where is she living?" I inquired, remembering her hysterical screams that she deserved the stolen money because she provided the proper aesthetic. "Her influencer career has been completely decimated," Olivia stated, her voice entirely factual. "The luxury lifestyle brands immediately terminated her sponsorship contracts when the news of the SEC investigation broke. The leasing company repossessed her Mercedes from a motel parking lot 3 months ago. She is currently renting a cramped 400-square-foot studio apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. She attempted to sell her collection of designer handbags to a luxury consignment broker just to cover her security deposit, but the broker informed her that half the bags Trent had purchased for her were actually high-tier counterfeits. I let out a low, breathy laugh, shaking my head at the sheer pathetic absurdity of it all. The golden child, the perfect, respectable daughter, who had spent her entire existence looking down on my ambition, was now living in a tiny box entirely stripped of the fake luxury she had sold her soul to maintain. And the tenants of the Fairfield estate, I asked, referring to Calvin and Vivian by their new legally mandated titles. Olivia opened the gray folder, revealing a meticulously highlighted spreadsheet of basic living expenses. They are physically comfortable but socially and psychologically isolated, she explained. I review their grocery and utility requests every Friday. Vivian attempted to submit a disguised reimbursement form last month. She tried to bury a $2,000 country club membership renewal fee under a line item labeled as emergency structural property maintenance. I raised an eyebrow. I assume you handled it. I immediately rejected the request and issued a formal written warning, Olivia said, her eyes gleaming with absolute authority. I informed her that any further attempts to defraud the blind trust would result in a 10% reduction of their monthly grocery allowance. She has not attempted to deviate from the approved budget since. Good, I replied, feeling a deep, resonating sense of closure. The reality of their situation is quite stark. Olivia continued, closing the folder with a definitive snap. Vivian's entire social circle completely abandoned her. The country club formally revoked their membership due to the association with a federal fraud investigation. She is no longer invited to a single charity gala, auction, or neighborhood event. Calvin has fully leaned into his forced early retirement. He rarely leaves the property. They spend their days rattling around a massive silent house they no longer own, entirely cut off from the wealthy elite society they prized over their own daughter. I sat in the quiet of my office, letting the full weight of the report wash over me. There was no guilt. There was no lingering sadness. There was only the clean, sterile reality of absolute justice. They had built a toxic artificial empire entirely funded by lies, theft, and deeply internalized prejudice. I had simply removed the foundation and watched it collapse under its own miserable weight. I had saved them from federal prison, but I had refused to save them from themselves. Olivia smiled, a genuine, warm expression that completely transformed her face. She stood up, picking up the gray folder and her tablet. She walked over to the closet near the door and pulled out my tailored camel-colored cashmere coat. We have a celebratory lunch reservation to get to Kendra, Olivia said, holding the coat out for me. The driver is already waiting downstairs in the loading bay. It is time to go. I stood up from my desk, feeling lighter than I had in 30 years. I slipped my arms into the warm cashmere coat, adjusted my collar, and grabbed my purse. Thank you, Olivia, I said, walking out of the corner office and closing the heavy mahogany door behind me. Let us go celebrate. The drive through the bustling streets of Atlanta was smooth and entirely devoid of the suffocating anxiety that used to accompany any meal involving my family. The armored corporate SUV glided effortlessly through the midday traffic, the tinted windows shielding us from the glare of the southern sun. I leaned back against the plush leather seating, listening to the quiet ambient jazz playing through the vehicle's premium sound system. Olivia sat across from me, reviewing a final set of digital contracts on her tablet, completely relaxed and entirely in her element. There was no frantic rehearsal of safe conversation topics in my head. There was no mental preparation for the inevitable barrage of backhanded compliments, racial microaggressions, or blatant disrespect. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm of two highly successful women preparing to enjoy a magnificent meal. The SUV pulled smoothly into the circular valet drive of the Heritage, the exact same upscale, heavily booked soul food restaurant where this entire chaotic saga had originally exploded 6 months prior. The sleek, modern exterior of the building, accented with dark wood and brushed brass, looked beautiful in the bright afternoon sunlight. The valet stepped forward, immediately opening my door with a respectful nod. I stepped out onto the pavement, the warm breeze catching the hem of my camel coat, and took a deep, refreshing breath of city air. As Olivia and I walked through the heavy glass double doors of the restaurant, the rich, intoxicating aromas of elevated Southern cuisine instantly surrounded us. The smell of slow braised collard greens, smoked Gouda macaroni and cheese, perfectly seared red snapper, and rich buttery cornbread filled the elegant dining room. The atmosphere was vibrant, filled with the sophisticated hum of business lunches, clinking crystal glasses, and genuine, joyous laughter. The sharp-dressed host at the front podium looked up, his eyes widening slightly in immediate recognition. "Miss Sterling," he said, his posture straightening into a stance of absolute professional respect. "It is an absolute pleasure to have you back with us. Your preferred corner booth is fully prepared and waiting for you." "Thank you," I replied, offering a warm, genuine smile. He grabbed 2 leather-bound menus and led us through the bustling dining room. As we walked past the long central tables, my mind briefly flashed back to the humiliating nightmare of the last time I was here. I remembered Vivian's shrill, embarrassed demands that I move to a different table. I remembered Trent's arrogant, mediocre face smirking at me from across the room. I remembered Calvin staring at his expensive watch, completely indifferent to my presence. The ghost of that toxic anxiety hovered for a fraction of a second before evaporating, entirely banished by the absolute certainty of my current reality. The host guided us to a beautiful semi-private booth nestled in the back corner of the restaurant, offering a sweeping, commanding view of the entire dining floor, while providing an intimate space for conversation. Olivia and I slid into the plush velvet upholstery. We ordered a spectacular spread of food, refusing to hold back or diminish our appetites. We requested the signature honey-glazed fried chicken, the blackened catfish over creamy stone-ground grits, the truffle butter biscuits, and a bottle of pristine, perfectly chilled sparkling water. When the food arrived, it was nothing short of culinary perfection. The flavors were bold, complex, and deeply satisfying. For the next hour, Olivia and I ate, laughed, and discussed the future. We talked about the international expansion of Apex Acquisitions. We discussed the brilliant, aggressive new strategies our marketing team was developing. We analyzed the shifting trends in the commercial real estate sector. The conversation flowed with a natural, effortless brilliance. There was no one sitting across from me picking apart my ambition. There was no one sneering at my independence. There was no one attempting to leverage my trauma for their own fragile ego. The profound, beautiful peace of eating a meal without swallowing insults with every single bite was a luxury I had finally secured for myself. As the lunch began to wind down and the plates were cleared by the attentive bus staff, a familiar figure approached our booth. It was the exact same waiter from 6 months ago, the young man who had been forced to awkwardly navigate the explosive hostility of my family's dinner. He stepped up to the edge of our table carrying a sleek black leather check folio. He looked at me, a flicker of nervous energy visible in his eyes, clearly remembering the intense, humiliating scene that had played out the last time he handed me a bill. He gently, almost cautiously, placed the leather book down on the polished wooden table, exactly halfway between Olivia and myself. "I hope everything was perfectly to your liking today, Miss Sterling," the waiter said, his voice carrying a quiet, deeply respectful tone. "The meal was absolutely flawless," I replied, smiling up at him with complete sincerity. "Thank you for your excellent service today." I did not feel a single drop of panic. My stomach did not twist into a painful, anxious knot. My hands did not tremble. There was no frantic calculation of how much money I had left in a depleted checking account. There was no suffocating pressure to prove my worth to a table full of people who fundamentally despised me. I smoothly reached into my designer purse and pulled out my wallet. With a calm, fluid motion, I extracted the heavy matte black titanium corporate card. It caught the ambient light of the restaurant, a physical, tangible representation of the empire I had built from the ground up. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I placed the heavy metal card firmly onto the leather folio. It landed with a soft, definitive clink. The waiter smiled, a look of profound relief and deep respect washing over his face. He picked up the folio and the titanium card, offering a slight bow of his head. "I will take care of this immediately for you, ma'am," he said, turning and walking swiftly toward the payment register. I leaned back against the plush velvet booth, looking out over the beautiful, bustling restaurant. I thought about the terrified, desperate girl I had been all those years ago, constantly shrinking myself to fit into a mold that was specifically designed to crush me. I thought about the relentless, exhausting marathon of trying to earn the love of parents who were deeply infected by their own anti-blackness and proximity to white mediocrity. I realized sitting in that booth what true power actually looked like. True power was not screaming on a manicured lawn about a fake aesthetic. True power was not relying on a fraudulent country club membership to feel important. True power was not begging for a seat at a toxic table where they only served humiliation and disrespect. True power was recognizing your own absolute brilliance, walking away from the people who refused to see it, and building your own table entirely from scratch. They called me a freeloader to make themselves feel big. But true power doesn't need to shout. It just waits for the right moment to hand you the bill. True family isn't defined by bloodline. It is defined by mutual respect, unconditional support, and showing up when it truly matters. When the people who are supposed to protect you try to tear you down, your greatest revenge is simply building a beautiful, wildly successful life entirely without them. You never have to accept a seat at a toxic, disrespectful table when you have the power to build your very own. Your inherent worth isn't determined by those who remain intentionally blind to your immense potential. Share your experiences of cutting toxic ties in the comments section down below today.